Chapter 292. The ACW was quietly placed among the red fallen leaves. The khaki-colored camouflage made the federal military's most powerful single-soldier long-range weapon lose its original metallic luster and chilling aura. However, the thick and empty barrel that protruded from the front of the red leaves was still as chilling as ever. The preloaded ammunition, electronic pulse ignition, and single-barrel composite control allowed this big gun to fire 3 shots in 0.05 of a second. The super-long sniping distance, the original tungsten alloy tail fins, and the addition of the magnetic resonance killing effect made the federal military snipers, as well as the Empire's military officers who thought they had killing value, engraved this big gun's name in their memories. The only downside was that it was too expensive. After the federal military developed it, they were elated, but they couldn't help but feel sad at the frightening cost. They knew that whether it was the President's office or the Senate's Budget Review Committee, it was impossible for the ACW to become the military's standard equipment. Therefore, the power of this big gun was only demonstrated a few times during the West Woods frontline tests. After that, it was always kept in storage and allowed to fade away. Shi Qinghai also couldn't afford the ACW. To be able to find this gun in the Federation's black market, he already felt that his luck was so good that it almost defied the heavens. He simply didn't care about the so-called cost. He directly killed that illegal arms dealer in South Dakota. Under the siege of the dealer's trusted aides, he escaped with great difficulty and managed to keep this big gun. With the ACW in hand, the world was his. Mr. Shi, who had undergone the best training from both the federal military and the anti-government forces, would definitely not have such an arrogant and stupid idea. Just like the leaders of Green Dragon Mountain often said, the deciding factor of victory or defeat on the battlefield would never be weapons. Otherwise, how could the guerrillas in the mountains last for so many years in front of the Federation government's mecha battleships? The information he received in the nightclub made him clear that the target could be far away at any time. Also, the sniper on the hill might not be effective. However, unlike his good friend, Shi Qinghai didn't plan to kill his way into the Golden Foundation's building and play a heroic role. He still wanted to test the power of the ACW. If it didn't work, he wouldn't be in a hurry. He would follow that person to the West Woods. The Federation's old proverb said that it was never too late for a gentleman to take revenge. Shi Qinghai wasn't a gentleman, he was a playboy. He might not be able to wait 10 years, but to kill someone like Macklin, he was willing to be patient. On the morning of January 18, year 68 of the constitutional calendar, he was lying down beside the ACW board. His head was pillowed on his red shirt, and his eyes were looking at the bright blue sky. His hands were holding the ACW's microcomputer screen, and he was watching an old movie to pass the time. His mouth was softly humming a song, and his attitude was very relaxed. It didn't seem like he was here to kill someone, but rather like he was here for an outing. Half of the screen was showing the movie, and the other half was showing the world through the ACW's electronic scope. The Golden Foundation's building was very quiet in the early morning. Occasionally, a guard would hide outside the room to smoke. The doors and windows of the orphanage and the Cultural Arts Center were tightly shut, and the children and girls were still sleeping. "Fatty, I didn't sleep the whole night. I was here to feed the autumn mosquitoes. I didn't let you down." Shi Qinghai pursed his very thin lips, and a smile flashed through his beautiful eyes. It was really hard for him not to smoke all night. He softly muttered to himself, and spoke to the teacher and director in the unseen world. His understanding of political figures made him conclude that Macklin would definitely be in his bedroom this morning to watch the Federation presidential inauguration ceremony on S1. There was still a long time before Macklin would walk out of his bedroom and enter the shooting range, so Shi Qinghai was not in a hurry. He just silently prayed that the old fox would not directly enter the special bulletproof car from the underground parking lot. Although he was very confident in the power of the ACW, Shi Qinghai really had no confidence in penetrating the armor of the bulletproof car from so far away and killing with one shot. In the boring waiting, Shi Qinghai even felt that he was about to fall asleep. If it weren't for the red leaves in the autumn forest that were a little stiff, if it weren't for the fact that the morning light couldn't illuminate the earth, and the environment was not warm enough, at this moment, he suddenly heard a scream. The sound came from the foot of the mountain, and it should be in the area of the Golden Foundations building. Because it was very far away, the sound was very soft and very soft. His hands that were holding the screen slightly stiffened, and he carefully listened to it, but found that he could no longer hear any sound. Was it an illusion? Shi Qinghai narrowed his eyes and gently touched the red touch button next to the screen. The movie automatically turned off, and the scenery on the scope occupied the entire screen. The view moved along with the slide of his right thumb on the red dot, slowly moving between the early morning buildings near the Golden Foundations building, looking for the source of the sound. The slight sizzling sound rang out in the autumn forest, and even the insects in the fallen leaves couldn't be disturbed. The thick barrel of the ACW moved slowly, giving a feeling of incomparable smoothness. However, the caliber of the barrel and the hollow silencer in front of the barrel revealed a palpitating murderous intent. Shi Qinghai was still lying in the fallen leaves, his eyes slightly narrowed, and the corners of his mouth slightly raised. Touching the red dot, he aimed the scope at the green space between the orphanage and the Cultural and Arts Center. On the side of the green space was the entrance to the underground parking lot. Next to the entrance was a simple toilet, and behind the toilet was a messy and difficult to step on. The bushes looked particularly gloomy in the dim light of the early morning. The barrel stopped moving, and the image on the screen stayed in the bushes. Shi Qinghai frowned, calmly and attentively looking there, paying attention to a few evergreen branches that swayed in the direction of the wind. It seemed that after a moment, a figure appeared on the screen. The person was wearing a loose sportswear, carrying a travel bag, and dressed like sunshine, but with a ghostly temperament. The person didn't walk out of the bushes, but walked directly to the auxiliary building of the Golden Foundations Cultural and Arts Center. The person began to climb the wall with his bare hand. The smooth exterior of the building didn't seem to have much effect on him, and the ivy and leaves attached to the wall just happened to cover his body. It seemed that after the scream, the guy was a little panicked and didn't dare to move forward according to the original path, but chose to climb the building with his bare hands. To be able to climb so quickly and easily while carrying such a heavy travel bag, even the top special forces of the federal military would not be able to do so. Without the support of a strong body, such a scene would definitely not be possible. The figure used a very short time to climb to the windowsill on the 4th floor. His movements were neat and tidy, without any sloppiness. Shi Qinghai looked at the person through the scope and couldn't help but feel a little shaken. He thought to himself that this method was a little too aggressive. When he climbed into the window, the person turned his body slightly, revealing half of his face under the brim of the hat. Although it was very blurry on the screen, it fell into Shi Qinghai's eyes so clearly. He did not exclaim out loud. He just narrowed his eyes and watched the guy disappear into the building. It confirmed his previous conjecture and intuition. It turned out that he was not the only one who wanted to kill Macklin. It turned out that the guy had really come. "Son of a bitch," Mr. Shi whispered, "you son of a bitch actually want to steal my business." Sulu was here, and he was the first one to sneak in. He didn't know if he had alerted the Foundation's security system, but Gongzi sure knew that he had to make some last-minute adjustments to today's plan. He quickly crawled out of the fallen leaves and came to the back of the ACW. He squinted his eyes and lowered his head to make the final adjustments to the parameters. After inputting the data on the microcomputer, he pulled the heavy gun back forcefully. The heavy gun moved smoothly on the preset back shock-absorbing slide, making a dull sound. With a click, the pulse electronic ignition system was turned on. Shi Qinghai silently lowered his head, focused on moving the aiming system and the barrel, and closely watched the several passages between the Cultural and Arts Center building and the Foundation's main building. No matter which passage Sulu would come out later, he would press the red button in his hand and use the bullets poured out from the top of the hill to open the way for his brave and somewhat stupid brother. Bumping into the little boy in the bushes was a matter of luck, and had nothing to do with the plan. Whether it was Sulu or Magnolia, or even the intelligence leader of the anti-government forces who was good at organizing, probably couldn't have predicted that the little boy in the orphanage would be so stubborn and naive that he would wait for the whole night to catch himself like a nocturnal animal in the bushes while the children in the orphanage were playing hide-and-seek at night. In a sense, the little boy had some excellent qualities, such as focus, persistence, and keeping his promise. In fact, Sulu also had these qualities. In another situation, perhaps Sulu would take the little boy to the amusement park and use ice cream as a sacrifice for his sworn brother. However, when the little boy believed that Sulu was a bad guy who sneaked into the orphanage with bad intentions, these qualities were very deadly. Whether it was the beautiful sisters and teachers in the orphanage, or the kind and amiable Grandpa Macklin in the Foundation, the little boy wanted to protect them all. Therefore, to Sulu's surprise, the little boy bravely screamed a warning. The brave Sulu might have failed the biggest thing he had done in his life because of the scream of such a brave little boy, so he was a little dumbfounded. Sulu reacted quickly and knocked the little boy unconscious on the ground, but his heart still palpitated. He didn't know how many people in the neighborhood were awake and heard the scream. "There are 7 guards coming." Magnolia's urgent but still calm voice sounded in the earpiece. "There are guards on all the roads. Go to the underground parking lot immediately and find a way to enter the Cultural and Arts Center on the 7th floor." The incident happened so suddenly that all the plans could not keep up with the changes. The guards in the street had obviously noticed the strange movements in the bushes. Secretary Bai on the mountain had been monitoring the movements of the other party through various probes, but she could only give him the target location. She could not help him find an undisturbed passage. The Cultural and Arts Center was the Foundation's auxiliary building. On the 7th floor, there was a bridge across the lake that led directly to the Foundation's main building. Sulu narrowed his eyes slightly and looked up at the building not far away. He noticed the dense green vines upstairs and made up his mind. When he walked past the unconscious little boy, he had already gotten rid of all the annoyance. It was impossible to sneak into Macklin's bedroom silently. It was just a matter of how long it took to be discovered. You should be a tenor in the future. He made such an evaluation of the brave little boy. Then, he took a deep breath and moved the scorching power in his body to his limbs, especially his 10 fingers. He forcefully grabbed the extremely thin cracks on the wall and began to rely on his inhuman strength to hang in the air, steadily and quickly climbing up the stairs. The sun had not risen and the autumn wind was cold. Sulu climbed between the vines and leaves, completely defying the laws that ordinary people could imagine. He was incomparably fierce. "The children in the bushes have been found. They are still checking the access control. The alarm system has not been activated yet. You have to hurry." Sulu lowered his head and walked quickly in the empty corridor. The green vines attached to the wall had lost their strength by the time they reached the 4th floor. He used his special ability when he was a teenager and quietly opened the horizontal latch of the window. He slipped into the Cultural and Arts Center building. He covered his ears and listened to the clear instructions in the earpiece. His mood was slightly relaxed. The guards have begun to assemble. The Special Task Force agents seem to be talking. We can't eavesdrop on them, but they may be preparing to investigate. Magnolia's voice in the earpiece was fast and steady. "Start to speed up." "Okay." Sulu nodded softly and sped up his pace. Although he was afraid of disturbing the people in the room, he deliberately lightened his footsteps and couldn't run as fast as he wanted, but he still sped up. "Go right upstairs." Sulu lowered his head and opened a door. He entered the stairs and walked to the 7th floor. At the door of the 7th floor, he heard the next instruction in the earpiece. Pause 3 seconds. 3 seconds later, he swept past the intersection like a gust of wind. He caught a glimpse of the backs of 2 guards in the corner of his eyes. He really did pass by them. Magnolia at the top of the mountain had already hacked into the surveillance system of the Golden Foundation Street and was quickly operating. On the one hand, she had to update and replace the images left by Su Lu in the surveillance camera. On the other hand, she had to pay attention to the movements of the security forces in all aspects and give him directions and instructions in time. No matter how exaggerated the instructions were, such as lowering his head to tie his shoelaces and turning around to stick to the foot of the wall, Su Lu did it meticulously without a second of doubt or hesitation. It was also because of this seamless cooperation that Su Lu was not discovered by anyone in the Cultural and Arts Center. However, the day was getting brighter and brighter, and more people were waking up. The most important thing was that the scream in the bushes downstairs had alerted many people. Therefore, it took less than a minute to speed up. Su Lu was already close to the 7th floor of the overpass and the target in the Golden Foundation building. There's a lone guard in front. Magnolia at the top of the mountain looked at the lattice image on the screen of the workbench. She looked at the burly guard and said, "Don't hide, grab something to wear." Su Lu was very obedient. She walked up to him and didn't stop. At the intersection of the 2 passageways, the burly guard suddenly found a suspicious young man in a hat with his head down in front of him. The guard's pupils shrank when he thought of the previous message from the intercom. He was ready to press the button to call the police. Although he was an excellent soldier who had followed the senator for many years, he was not ready to take the risk of an assassin who dared to invade the Golden Foundation building. Unfortunately, Su Lu didn't give him the chance to show his maturity and stability. His military boots slid across the smooth stone floor, and his strength exploded in an instant. Both of his hands struck out horizontally, smashing into the upper body of the guard like breaking rotten wood. After 2 strange cracking sounds, the guard's body stiffened and fell to the ground. Under the command of Magnolia, Su Lu dragged the guard to an empty room and changed into the uniform. In the original plan, there was no such thing as a change of equipment. It was only because the accident happened earlier than planned that Bai Yulan issued this order. Wearing a slightly oversized guard uniform, Su Lu touched the hard layer between his chest and abdomen. Only then did he realize that if the guard was not burly enough, he would not have been able to put on the uniform at all. Dragging the travel bag on the ground, Su Lu pulled down the brim of his hat and walked openly on the overpass. Below the overpass was a man-made lake. In the open space by the lake, some guards could be seen gathering. Some armed security personnel with heavy weapons began to occupy the advantageous terrain. Further away, Special Task Force agents of the Federation in black formal suits could be seen. They seemed to be on the phone with someone. Su Lu dragged the travel bag and walked on the overpass. Looking down, he could see the golden sunlight under the faint clouds in the distance. The sunlight shone on his face and warmed his face. The surveillance system was still under Bai Yulan's control. He was wearing a guard's uniform, and he walked across the bridge so openly and confidently that he did not attract the attention of the people under the bridge. At that moment, he could not help but thank the staff in Senator Macklin's office for not trusting the Special Task Force. If the Foundation had not placed the Special Task Force agents at the outermost periphery, with the level of professionalism of the Special Task Force, they would never have made such a mistake. As he walked on the overpass, Magnolia's voice sounded in his earpiece again. The enemy has finished gathering, and the internal alarm has been sounded. The standard level of detection after an enemy attack is to perform a self-check on the monitoring system. I can protect you for about 20 seconds. Su Lu did not stop walking. I need to temporarily leave the building's monitoring system to avoid being exposed. I'll take it back in 10 minutes. During this time, you'll be alone. You have to be careful. Understood. We're going to start killing. Don't think about innocent things like last night. The armed personnel in the Foundation building are all ruthless people who have been with Macklin for many years. If you insist that Macklin is guilty, then I believe that they are all guilty. Understood. Sulu walked across the overpass and entered the main building of the Foundation building. Just then, the 20 seconds were up. The opponent's security system began to perform a self-check. Magnolia left the monitoring system, and he would be alone to face all the difficulties and resistance. At this time, Sulu had successfully penetrated 2 layers of the Foundation's defense with the help of intelligence and Magnolia's professional intelligence. He avoided the Special Task Force agents and the security company's line of defense, and was approaching the core area. However, this building was also the most dangerous place. This was because the building's security guards were all armed personnel who had been with Macklin for many years. Most of these armed personnel were from the anti-government army and were well trained. Moreover, Sulu believed that the other party must also have the quality of ruthlessness. In the deep Foundation building, there were no staff members because of the time. Through the doors of the rooms, the faint sound of the TV news could be heard. Sulu walked through the corridor with his head down, dragging the heavy travel bag beside him. He knew that his figure had fallen into the monitoring system at this time, and he could only pray that the other party would not discover him later. The internal alarm had been silent for a long time, and the Foundation building was heavily guarded. "You shouldn't have come here." Hearing this sentence, Sulu raised his head and looked at the 2 staff members in front of him in confusion. The 2 staff members' cold faces revealed a sense of danger. He did not know how many battles they had participated in, but they were not wearing the guard's uniform. It would be more appropriate to call them armed personnel. Moreover, Sulu could clearly see that there were 2 guns hidden under their coats. Sulu lowered his head again and charged forward. Before the 2 militants could pull out their guns, he twisted his body and squeezed between the 2 of them with a posture that was already engraved in his bones. One of his palms slashed across the throat of one of them, while the other fiercely punched the forehead of the other. 2 crisp sounds of bones breaking were heard, and the 2 armed personnel fell directly to the ground without a sound. They were also powerful soldiers who had been reborn in blood. However, in front of Sulu, who moved as fast as lightning, had terrifying strength and valiant skills, they could not even stop him. Sulu lowered his head, picked up the travel bag on the ground, and moved forward again. As long as he made a move, his whereabouts would be exposed. He could only complete today's task by entering Macklin's bedroom before anyone could react. A low and clear alarm began to sound in the Foundation building, which was different from the previous internal alarm. It told everyone that the enemy had invaded and caused damage. In the sound of the alarm, the dark red rotating lights on the walkway also lit up. Sulu began to run forward at an extremely fast speed without the slightest pause. He knew that he was now being watched by the surveillance network. As long as he stopped at a certain place, he would be surrounded by countless guards. A door on the left was suddenly pushed open, and a muzzle was aimed at the running Sulu, ready to pull the trigger. Sulu turned his head, raised his arm, and the muzzle spat out a flame first. As the clear recoil was transmitted to his palm, a delicate bloody hole appeared between the eyebrows of the armed personnel behind the door. Blood spurted out from the back of the man's head and smeared on the white wall. He lowered his head and continued to move forward. Suddenly, he forced himself to stop and flew to the side. There was a burst of gunfire, and countless bullet marks and smoke appeared where he had been. In the sound of gunfire, gravel flew everywhere, and the sound was deafening. In the dim light, no one could see the traces of bullets, but they could clearly smell the scent of death. Sulu sat in the corner of the wall, exhaled heavily, licked his dry lips, and muttered F***ck. Then he opened the travel bag at his feet, revealing the guns with a metallic luster inside. The heavily armed guards rushed upstairs according to the instructions of the surveillance system, and the fastest few wanted to rush over the bridge across the lake on the 7th floor to cut off the intruders' escape route. Once they rushed over, Sulu, who had been intercepted, would have no chance of survival. However, at this moment, a crisp sound suddenly rang from the distant top of the mountain. The sound came from the red leaves and fell on the lake. It was extremely beautiful, but the effect was extremely bloody. The 3 guards who rushed at the front seemed to have been hit by 3 heavy punches. Their bodies trembled, and then they were separated. Then they knelt down and turned into broken limbs. The first guard was shot in the waist, the second guard was shot in the chest, and the third guard was shot in the head. But no matter which part of the body was shot, they could only die. This was the power of ACW. Chapter 293. Under the morning sun, the city was shrouded in tranquility. However, the unexpected crisp gunshots easily tore apart this facade. The gunshots rang out from the top of Chilin Mountain in the northeast corner of the block. The sound pierced through the morning sky and entered everyone's ears, shocking their minds. Shi Qinghai crouched low in the red and yellow leaves. He narrowed his eyes and stared at the image on the monitor screen. His right thumb quickly touched the red control button. With his precise and stable control, the powerful ACW beside him changed the direction of the muzzle along with the sound of electric current. It was like an indifferent one-eyed king looking at the weak people under his feet who were about to die. The caliper positioning on the monitor screen kept moving around the foundation building at an extremely fast speed. However, there was no trace of stagnation in the image. Wherever the king's gaze was, it was exceptionally clear. As his thumb gently tapped on the red control button, the heavy ACW seemed to have been stimulated by something. It fiercely paused, and flames spurted out from the front end of the thick barrel. 3 bullets installed with tungsten alloy tail fins whizzed out, and the metal body of the gun would suddenly slide backward due to the strong recoil, quickly retreating along the metal chute installed on the ground, and then hit the defensive layer. The sound of the high-speed bullet was not loud when it was fired, but it cut through the air. When it reached hundreds of meters in the air, it began to carry a mournful whistling sound. It was a torture to the human ear. The federal military had never thoroughly studied the sound suppression technology of the ACW. It had to be said that the biggest drawback of this big gun was probably this. Shi Qinghai stared at the monitor screen expressionlessly. He quickly and steadily operated the red button in his hand. Every time his thumb tapped, a life in the block far away would explode into a bloody flower. The top of the mountain was very far from the building. He could see the clear images of the deaths, but he could not hear the tragic screams. In addition, the ACW was completely different from the previous heavy sniper rifles. It could completely separate the shooter from the real world, turning the long-distance killing into indifferent and boring finger movements. Red leaves fell to the ground in the forest. The ACW was firing in an irregular but particularly clear rhythm. Click, 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 click. The heavy body of the gun moved back from time to time. The red leaves were scattered by the impact. The air in the distance was full of screams. The traces of the white fog were faintly visible in the morning dew. The gunshots were sharp and countless lines of death were launched. All the passages around the foundation building were tightly blocked. Bursts of red fell. Several corpses were bleeding on the bridge above the lake. Several guards who tried to rush over were also killed. The concrete blocks on the bridge had rolled and cracked, like gloomy flowers blooming. When the foundation building was originally designed, most of the design was near the lake. There were only 3 passages from the top and bottom of the building. The foundation, in the name of peace, was always thinking about things that were not peaceful. There was no doubt that there was a strong sense of irony. Since the foundation was built for so many years, there had never been any vicious incident. This design, which was easy to defend and difficult to attack, had never been effective. However, today's sudden attack made the armed forces in the building feel deeply panicked. The enemy had raided the building, but there was a powerful sniper on the mountain using a super long-range weapon that they did not expect to block all the passages into the building. The design concept of the foundation building, which was easy to defend and difficult to attack, tied all their hands and feet at this time. Rush in. Hearing the rapid gunshots and a few screams from inside the building, the security personnel outside the building were anxious. They did not know how many people had sneaked into the building, nor did they know whether the senator was safe at this time. The Foundation's internal monitoring network had just finished a self-check, and it would take some time for all the information to be fed back. Below the building, several guards who bravely rushed to the front door were tragically turned into a few flowers of blood. The sniper on the mountain top fired a series of precise and cold-blooded shots, turning all the potted plants and wooden fences along the way into pieces. In the pieces flying in the air, all the people who tried to rush into the building were turned into corpses or wounded on the ground. The threat of death sent chills down everyone's spines. Be it the Special Task Force agents who rushed over or the guards of the security company, all of them crouched on the ground and hid in the shadows of the buildings. If they showed their heads, the god of death on the mountaintop would reap their lives. In an office on the first floor of the Cultural and Arts Center, a captain of the Special Task Force stared at the monitor screen with a livid face. Listening to the replies of his subordinates in his ears, he angrily slammed the table and shouted, "There is only one gun on the mountain. If we all rush in, who can stop us?" Although he said so, he did not forcibly give the order for all members to attack. The captain of the Special Task Force of the Federation had always had a strong opinion about the security arrangements of the counselor's office. The counselor obviously did not trust the agents sent by the government, so they had been excluded from the building. If the Special Task Force had fully taken over the security and defense of the Foundation from the beginning, they would not have been caught off guard by the enemy. The captain, who was almost middle-aged, knew very well why the counselor's office did not trust them. He was also reluctant to let his subordinates, who had followed him through life and death, risk their lives for the counselor under the rain of bullets from the cold-blooded sniper on the mountain. However, he had to find a way to solve the problem at hand because of his duty. As soon as the internal alarm was confirmed, the captain had contacted the police headquarters in the 4 states and the nearest garrison of the 2nd Military Region through the internal line. He believed that no matter how many killers came from outside, as long as the Foundation building could be delayed for a while, the safety of the counselor should not be a big problem. Several agents of the Special Task Force had already rushed to the mountain, hoping that they could get rid of the sniper as soon as possible. "Has the counselor entered the passage?" The captain pressed on his headset and asked quickly. "Yes, he has." The intercom in the office was always on, and the sound of the static was mixed with the calls of the armed personnel in the Foundation building. Listening to the calls and seeing the intruder's figure flash quickly on the surveillance screen, the captain's pupils shrank sharply, and he felt a chill that he had never felt before. The security personnel's curses, shouts, and tense tactical commands were constantly heard from the intercom. "Spread out. That person is coming." The intercom rang out with the sound of gunshots, muffled grunts after being shot, and chaotic footsteps when retreating or chasing. "Mother ***, that guy is too fast." The voice in the communication device came to an abrupt halt, and a few crisp gunshots seemed to carry a few spiraling echoes. "The 3 Eastern Districts. The 3 Eastern Districts. Stop him." The captain looked at the assassin in the security guard's uniform on the surveillance screen, rushing through the screen like a gust of wind and entering the corridor. He felt the hair on his body stand on end. The other party was about to kill his way to the 3 Eastern Districts in such a short time. How did he avoid such dense firepower in the building? The voice that ordered the armed personnel to set up a defense line in the 3 Eastern Districts belonged to the head bodyguard of Counselor Macklin. That voice, which had always been confident and proud, trembled in front of the assassin today. The face of the Special Task Force's captain was ashen as he rubbed the curly hair on his head in agony. He could not believe what he had just seen on the monitor. Even the most elite special forces of the Federation military would not have been able to react so quickly, wield such ferocious firepower, and use such extremely precise means of attack. In just a few minutes, that person had killed 7 bodyguards, broken through 2 lines of defense, and was about to enter the 3 eastern districts of the Foundation building. When he had just received the alarm of an intruder, the captain had been calculating how many people the other party had sent to attack the Foundation building, which was protected by 3 layers of defense. But what he did not expect was that until now, they had only found 2 people. The 2 of them dared to come in so openly? If it had been in the past, the captain would have thought that this was a big joke. However, the lines of death cutting across the space, and the assassin moving silently and quickly in the building made him realize that today's 2 attackers were not ordinary people. What made him feel even colder was that the attacker in the building had used some unknown method to quietly enter the core area. He was not discovered until he entered the Foundation building. Motherf ****. When will the troops get here? The captain roared angrily, then picked up the communication device in his hand and issued an order with a frosty expression. We must find that person on the mountain within 3 minutes. The rest of the teams, move closer to the side of the building and break in immediately. His expression was extremely ugly. Suddenly, he thought of something and said quickly in a low voice, "There must be tactical support personnel outside, otherwise that person would not have been able to sneak in. Check the internal monitoring again and search for abnormal signal emitting node. Do not alarm them, go up and find the area where the signal is received." Knowing that the councilman had entered the passage, the captain was not as nervous as he appeared to be. Years of experience in the Special Task Force allowed him to issue correct orders in an orderly manner. Whether it was in terms of firepower or other aspects, the 2 intruders could only be considered as failures in the end. However, when the captain saw the images on the monitor, he could not help but shudder. The intruder in the image with a travel bag on his back was running quickly with his head down, holding 2 Federal military standard guns in his hand. The intruder did not seem to raise his head to aim, but the guns in his hands never stopped firing. The tongues of fire were like dragons, spitting between the corridors. The paint, cement, and wallpaper, regardless of whether it was hard or soft, were all torn into pieces and floating in the air filled with the smell of gunpowder. Before the pieces fell, the figure with his head down had already killed, like a cold wind. Chapter 294. There were no landmines in front of him, nor was there a bottomless abyss. However, Sulu, who was hiding behind the wall, still felt an endless chill because there was a hail of bullets there. Since he had crossed the stars to come here, then he would bravely advance forward. However, those ear-piercing sounds of gunfire and the concrete fragments that flew in all directions at the corner of the wall blocked his path. He sniffled, lowered his head, and took out 2 black Cayenne folding light machine guns from his bag. He weighed them in his hands, occasionally tilting his head. The firepower at the entrance was too fierce, directly suppressing him behind the wall. He could not poke his head out at all. Dust had already filled the dimly lit corridor. The alarm kept ringing, and those flying concrete fragments accompanied by loud explosions struck his body at high speed. There was some dull pain, especially on his exposed lower jaw, where blood could already be seen. If he had been inside the MX Mecha right now, this building would have been easily destroyed by him. He would not have had to be stuck in this small space with Bullet. He slung the travel bag tightly on his back again, leaving a hole of just the right size. He raised the gun in his hand, and with a flick of his wrist, the cold and murderous folding Cayenne light machine gun in his right hand automatically came off with a soft click. The handle was still in his hand, but the black barrel was already pointed in the direction of the corridor entrance. His somewhat dry and pale lips trembled rapidly a few times, as if he was cursing a few vulgarities. Su-Lu took several deep breaths to shake off his nervous emotions. A hint of valiance flashed through his eyes as he stood up and pulled the trigger. A low and loud gunshot rang out, and countless bullets roared out. At the same time, he kicked off the bullet-riddled corner of the wall, and all the terrifying strength in his body was unleashed. His entire body swept horizontally through the smoke-filled corridor, but it was slanted upwards, heading straight for the corner of the wall. The muscle fibers on his left leg tightened up one by one, erupting with great strength. In just the blink of an eye, Su-Li's body had already swept to the corner of the wall. Then, he forcefully turned around and charged into the smoke. While he was making this series of high-speed movements, the two cards in his hands continued to spit out flames, hitting the walls inside the building with crashing sounds. Once the firepower at the gate was slightly suppressed, they raised their heads again. These well-trained militants had experienced countless battles with Macklin in the Green Dragon Mountains. Naturally, they would not make such a tactical mistake. In fact, the density of the bullets instantly increased because they knew that the invaders would definitely choose to force their way in. However, the militants made a habitual mistake. The direction of the bullets was mainly downward. Generally speaking, people who relied on firepower to break through would choose to glide along the ground quickly in order to avoid the blockade. They did not expect that the invaders today would have such a strange and terrifying physique that they could actually traverse a distance of more than 3 meters with just a single step. The corner of the wall was already soft from the gunfire, and Su-Lu stomped on it with his left foot, causing it to immediately collapse. Just as the strangely shaped cement blocks fell to the ground, Su-Lu had already passed through the smoke and landed heavily on the side of the gate, narrowly avoiding the dangerous bullets dancing in the corridor. Ta-ta-ta! Ta-ta-ta! The two Kayans spat out flames and swept fiercely at the 3 militants in front of him. Su-Lu lowered his head and rushed over. He did not have time to swing his arms forward, so he directly kicked the knee of the person who was still standing. With a crack, that person's knee immediately bent and broke. Before the scream could be heard, Su-Lu had already retracted his hands. With a wave of his left hand, he swung the MP5 submachine gun that the person was holding tightly in his hand. The barrel of his right hand directly pressed against the person's abdomen and pulled the trigger without hesitation. A muffled sound suddenly rang out like a sudden rainstorm in a dense forest. That militant did not even have time to make a sound before he was directly sent flying by the bullet from the muzzle. Blood splattered everywhere in the smoke, and it was exceptionally bloody. Su-Lu wiped the blood off his face and did not look at the numbing and itchy wound on his left shoulder. Since his left arm was fine, it was probably just a graze from the shrapnel in the chaotic battle. He looked at the corridor in front of him, quickly took out the magazine from his back, and continued to rush over with his head lowered. An intruder with astonishing speed, 2 Kayan's light machine guns, 2 flames, a rain of bullets, dense and muffled gunfire in the foundation building, and figures constantly falling on both sides of the road. With the help of the mysterious power in his body, Su-Li's strength and speed were more powerful than the best professional soldier. The calmness of a mechanic allowed him to perfectly control his every movement on such a dangerous battlefield. What was even more shocking was his observation ability and reaction speed. In the smoke and whistling bullets, he was like a shadow, relying on the few objects in the corridor to quickly rush forward. He had never learned any of the assault tactics of the Federal Army. Such a dauntless and fearless assault seemed more like a foolish act of courting death. However, it was this very unprofessional tactical choice, combined with his extremely powerful combat ability, that caught the armed personnel in the building off guard. These armed men who had just woken up from their sleep did not expect that after the invaders broke through the first door, they did not take any rest and rushed over in the rain of bullets. The cayennes in Su Li's hands continued to spew flames, reaping the lives of the people in the field. He was able to discover the location of the intruder earlier than the intruder, so he could effectively dodge and shoot in the shortest amount of time. It had to be said that in the underground armory of Whitewater Company, Secretary Bai had spent more than 10 days of special training to make him a real killer. In less than 15 seconds, he had already passed through the corridor, leaving behind the corpses of the 5 militants. The moment the door opened, Su Lu clearly heard the last bullet of the cayenne's light machine gun in his hand. At the same time, he saw 2 shadows under the wall outside the door. There were 2 people hiding there, and they had quietly raised their guns in their hands and were ready to shoot. He did not stop moving forward, and with the strength of his arms, he threw the cayennes in his hands. The fully metal machine heavily smashed into the wall, and with a huge force, it quickly smashed back at the 2 people hiding behind the door. The 2 militants subconsciously turned their muzzles slightly, but at this time, Su Lu had already rushed behind the door. His right hand reached out like lightning, and grabbed the hot gun barrel of the other party. With a strong twist, only a strange sound was heard, and the metal gun barrel was bent. His palm moved up the gun barrel and fiercely chopped at the man's throat. At the same time, his body suddenly moved back and pressed into the arms of the other militant, crushing the gun in the other's hand, making it impossible for him to shoot. His elbow struck out viciously, striking the sturdy gun, and the huge force shook the militant's body. The militant who was chopped in the throat had a look of shock and disbelief in his white eyes. The bent gun fell to the ground. He covered his broken throat with his hand and slowly sat down against the wall. The other militant behind the door had his sternum completely shattered. He fell to the ground, unconscious and on the verge of death. Su Lu, who was covered in blood, moved a few steps to the left and hid himself behind the printer. After a few rapid breaths, his pale face slightly returned to normal. But then, he put his trembling right arm into the travel bag on his back, took out a cayennes, and stood up. This was the gun he was best at. Since he entered the building, 13 people had already died by his hands. The crisp sound of the Cayenne light machine gun and the clear recoil made Su Lu very clear what he was doing. At this moment, he didn't have the time to think about whether it was right or wrong for him to kill Macklin today. He also didn't have the mood to analyze whether there was a hidden factor of violence in his body. He only knew that he had to speed up. After glancing at the structural diagram of the foundation building displayed on his watch, Su Lu wiped the blood on his face and walked toward the 3 eastern districts. The images of his walk were all recorded by the monitoring equipment inside the building, and then transmitted to the temporary headquarters in the auxiliary building. It was this series of fast and shocking scenes of gunfire and killing that made the captain of the Special Task Force shudder. On the other side of the foundation building, some sounds of defense could be faintly heard, but Su Lu did not seem to hear it. As he ran quickly in that direction, he looked at his watch to calculate the appointed time for Secretary Bai to rehack the system. At the same time, he made a final check of his equipment. At this time, a loud sound came from a place hundreds of meters away from the building. It was a violent explosion, and a black cloud rose up. The strong shock wave directly swept over, shattering all the glass windows in the foundation building. Countless fragments jingled and danced in the air. Su Lu lowered his head and walked forward, covering his head with his arms. It seemed that he did not care about the sudden explosion. In fact, he knew that it must have been the white magnolia on the top of the mountain who detonated the plastic high-energy bomb placed in the exit toilet of the parking lot. That bomb was installed by Su Lu himself, and he was very clear about the power of the explosion. According to the information provided by the anti-government forces, the secret passage from the senator's office to the underground parking lot should have been blown up, but he did not know if Macklin was killed, or if the senator was blown back. Because he could not be sure, he had to rush in again with a gun in hand and kill that guy. However, before he broke into the 3 eastern districts, he felt a little strange because after a burst of noise inside the building, it suddenly quieted down. With his superhuman hearing, he could vaguely hear the sound of hurried footsteps below. Had the senator's security backup finally arrived? Sulu narrowed his eyes slightly. According to his plan, these backup forces should have arrived long ago. He did not know who was helping him delay, but it seemed that this delay had lost its effect. Holding the Cayenne with both hands, he narrowed his eyes and looked at the empty hall in front of him, which was full of infinite danger. He slowly raised the gun, put it to his eyes, and began to accurately aim. At the same time, he gradually slowed down. Chapter 295. The 3 eastern districts were the second branch of the 4 Continents Foundation Hall. The room was about 400 square meters and was divided into numerous grid areas by light blue partitions that were half the height of a person. Desks and computers were placed in each area. It could be imagined that on a normal day, there must be countless amiable and lovely ladies here, answering the phone while quickly typing on the keyboard. In the midst of countless grateful voices, donations from various regions of the Federation continued to be channeled into the Foundation's account. However, today the office area was quiet or dead silent. There was no sound of typing on the keyboard, no phone ringing. Only some rapid breathing could be faintly heard, and the owner of those breaths was hidden somewhere. The fierce battle in the morning did not seem to have affected this place. The corridor between the 2 walls was full of bullet holes and corpses, but there were no traces left here. Even the green plants by the transparent floor-to-ceiling windows on both sides were still so gentle in the faint morning light. Sulu raised the Cayenne gun and held it parallel to his chin. Using the standard movement of the Federal Army, he aimed at the empty space in front of him that was filled with killing intent. He forced his way through the corridor because he did it unexpectedly. With the opponent's unpredictable speed and lethality, he rushed forward valiantly. The silence made him extremely vigilant. By Magnolia's soft voice in the earpiece did not sound again. The monitoring system inside the Foundation building was not taken back. He could not determine where those people were hiding in the 3 eastern districts, behind the desk or in the shadow of the green plants. The previous explosion made Sulu confirm that Macklin had chosen the secret passage to leave as planned. Since the secret passage was blown up, Macklin should have been forced to return to his room at this time. And to get to Macklin's room, the 3 eastern districts were an area that had to be passed through. The key was that the hurried footsteps downstairs made it clear to him that the armed forces in the building had begun to gather in his direction. If his movements were slow, the only outcome left for him would be to be surrounded by countless firepower, which would be a miserable end. The military boots slowly took 2 steps forward without making any sound. Sulu narrowed his eyes and slowly and steadily scanned every corner of the office through the scope of the Cayenne light machine gun without a trace of trembling. Suddenly, a green plant that was about the height of a person by the floor-to-ceiling window swayed. Under the cover of the morning light, a militant opened fire at him. Because of the sunlight, Sulu narrowed his eyes. Even though he knew that the other party had fired, he didn't make any evasive movements. He just steadily pointed the muzzle in that direction. With a few clear sounds, the wall beside Sulu was pierced with a few bullet holes. The wallpaper was filled with a burnt smell, and it began to flutter in the air. Almost at the same time, his finger pulled the trigger. Following the clear feeling of the recoil and the muffled sound, the green plants by the window scattered and smoke rose. The green leaves scattered, and the militant who had been silently hiding behind them didn't even make a sound. He leaned back and fell to the ground. Sulu suddenly turned around and pulled the trigger at an extremely fast speed. He accurately shot through the light blue partition and killed a militant in the 11 o'clock direction on his left. He held the Cayenne light machine gun horizontally, narrowed his eyes, and fired quickly and accurately. In less than 7 seconds, more than 20 bullets had been fired, valiantly suppressing the militants hiding in the corners of the 3 eastern districts, making them unable to move. Occasionally, there were bullets whistling past his body, but his aiming speed was too fast. He just stood on the flat ground at the entrance of the 3 eastern districts. The Cayenne in his hand spat out flames at a certain rhythm. The militants didn't dare to poke their heads out, so naturally, there was no accuracy. But in such a battlefield, this guy actually dared to stand and break in. It could only be said that he had seen through life and death. He had already walked 7 steps into the 3 eastern district. The back of the Cayenne hit his shoulder heavily. He didn't miss a single shot, and once again pulled the cold trigger on his finger. The sharp bullet line shot straight forward, bringing a cluster of light smoke, and shot the hand holding the gun that had just reached out from behind the desk into countless pieces of minced meat. Screams sounded. At the same time, intensive gunshots sounded, instantly shattering the dead silence in the office and the monotonous gunshots from before. Su Li's pupils suddenly shrank, and then he realized that the real firepower in this office was much more powerful than what was shown before. The personal armed forces of Macklin had been waiting until now, just to let him go deep into the 3 eastern districts, and there was no escape. The sky was full of bullets whistling. Su Li's face was pale, and the power in his body all burst out at this moment, and passed to the military boots. The soles of the boots bloomed in an instant, and the inhuman power stomped on the ground. The dark carpet was broken into pieces, and his body had already fallen back. He tightly curled up, and like a reverse arrow, he fell back toward the entrance. No matter how powerful a person was, he couldn't run faster than a bullet. He didn't know if Feng Yu or that old man Li's of Philadelphia could do it, but in Su Li's mind, normal people couldn't do this, so when the intensive gunshots sounded, he knew that he had no other choice but to dodge. In the air, he scattered the Cayenne in his hand with full power, continuously pouring bullets, wanting to suppress some of the firepower that had been waiting for this moment. While he was still in the air, 2 meters away from the entrance of the 3 eastern districts, Su Li's body had already shrunk, trying to reduce his size as much as possible. The barrel of the Cayenne in his hand had already started to turn red, and the office was filled with terrifying screeching sounds. A deeper gunshot sounded, and Su Li's body in the air seemed to have been hit by a heavy hammer. He flew back even faster and directly fell to the ground. He was shot 3 times, and the most fatal one was the last one in the chest. When the first gunshot sounded in the building of the 4 States Peace Foundation in S2, gunshots also sounded in the distant S1 Charter Square, which was more solemn and dignified than usual. At the guardrail under the statue of the Group of 5 in Charter Square, a row of Federation soldiers in dark military uniforms stood there with solemn expressions. Their hands were tightly gripping the shiny metal guns in front of their chests. Their movements were beautiful and clean as they raised the guns over their shoulders, aimed at the sky, and fired. The gunshots were neat and uniform, as if one person was firing. As the gunshots spread out in spirals, the deliberately added colorful powder turned into white smoke in the clean winter air, and the gunfire was beautiful. The fat white pigeons on the lawn were already suffering from the cold winter, so they lazily hid in the pigeon house set up by the Square Management Center to keep warm. Suddenly, they were awakened by the crisp gunshot. Their instinct buried deep in their bones made them start to fear. Perhaps they thought of the miserable past of their ancestors being eaten by humans, so they all drilled out of the pigeon house and tried to fly away in horror. However, they were already too fat, and it was unknown whether the tips of their wings had degenerated or been cut off. How could they fly high into the snowy sky? They could only clumsily flutter around, looking like the pitiful hens in the ancient chicken farms recorded in movies. At the Parliament Square connected to Charter Square, a series of gunshots also sounded at this time. However, unlike the fat pigeons on the lawn, on both sides of the stone steps of the Parliament building, on both sides of the lake opposite the Parliament Mountain, on the lawn, the ordinary citizens who came to watch the ceremony, as well as the officials and parliamentarians on the viewing platform, all had smiles and pride on their faces. There was no trace of panic. This was the inauguration ceremony of the Federation president, not a funeral, so only a series of gunshots rang out, followed by the sound of cannon salutes. It was already 10 o'clock, and the rumbling of cannon salutes rang through the sky, waking up all the sleepy people in the capital's special district. In fact, no matter how unconcerned they were with politics, or how much they ridiculed the Federation government, they would probably wake up today to watch this grand event. After all, it was a grand event that happened once every 5 years. In fact, the people of the entire universe, whether it was nighttime or dawn, were all watching Charter Square, Parliament Mountain, and the core of the Federation through television. The two connected squares at the front and back of Parliament Mountain were already filled with people, and people were whispering with joy. The Federation welcomed a new president, and in the context of great reconciliation, even the president's political enemies could not dig up any misdeeds, so the citizens of the Federation had high expectations for the new government. The news channel of the Federation TV station and a few other major television stations had already set up countless broadcasting stations, and the heavy cameras were like black holes of cannons, aimed at the people attending the inauguration ceremony, and transmitted the sincere or fake smiles on their faces to thousands of households. The wireless cameras that hovered around the viewing platform and the stone steps of Parliament Mountain were like loyal roaming sentries, vigilantly watching the surroundings, and transmitting all the details that were worth paying attention to back to the broadcasting vehicles, such as the material of the oath-taking platform on the stone steps of Parliament Mountain, and the faces of the political bigwigs on the viewing platform. The viewing platform was connected to the stone steps of Parliament Mountain, and the old man who stood closest to the oath-taking platform was the president of the Federation Parliament. This vice-president-cum-president was ending his political career today, but looking at his expression, he was quite relaxed and at ease. Beside the president was naturally the vice-president, and the vice-president's expression was a bit heavy. After the new president was inaugurated, he still had to carry out his duties in the majestic Parliament building, and he just had to cooperate with the new president. Perhaps he was thinking about this, or perhaps he had already started thinking about the parliamentary election in a few years. A few members of the National Security Council were also at the back. The chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff of the Federation, the commander of the 1st Military Region, General Miles, stood at the front with a cold expression, and beside him were the commanders of the 2nd Military Region and the 3rd Military Region. The cameraman of the Federation News Channel, wearing sunglasses, controlled the suspended camera on the arm and slowly flashed past the faces of these important people. These important people had been through who knows how many big scenes, and they maintained their facial expressions extremely well, without a trace of trembling at all. On the contrary, the staff in the temporary broadcasting center behind the Parliament building were excited by the familiar faces that flashed past on the camera. All the important people of the Federation government, Parliament, and military were present, and this was a rare scene. The female 3-star Federal Fleet General Hong Yuliang had come. This middle-aged female general who was used to drifting in the universe stood calmly in the crowd, unassuming, but exceptionally eye-catching, because everyone knew that she rarely landed on the surface of a planet in the past few years. During President Sieg's inauguration ceremony last time, she was still far away near the Bermuda Space Passage, and did not return to S1 at all. Who was the middle-aged general beside her, wearing a dark military uniform, with a cold and indifferent expression? The reporters in the broadcasting center looked at that face and simultaneously sucked in a cold breath. Commander Zhong of the 4th Military Region, far away in the West Woods, actually came as well? When did he arrive at the capital? Why was there no news yet? The leader of the 7 major families of the Federation and the most powerful military general of the Federation, who had been absent from 2 presidential inauguration ceremonies in a row, actually came in person this time? Tens of thousands of spectators had gathered in front of the Parliament Hill, but the focus of the news was still on the important people on the viewing platform. The citizens watching the news on TV curiously identified the identity and power of these important people, and they were unusually excited. The big shots on the viewing platform, the reporters in the broadcast center, the higher-ups of the major television stations who were watching all of this, and the reporters who were waiting to submit their manuscripts silently looked at the faces that were familiar, or should have been familiar, but had become somewhat unfamiliar. However, they were not as excited as the ordinary people. Instead, they felt a trace of a strange emotion, but this emotion was positive and encouraging. Everyone had arrived, even the eccentric General Hong and Commander Zhong, who had always been indifferent to the Federation, had arrived. This demonstrated an atmosphere of great unity that had never been seen before. In front of the threat of the Empire, after the turmoil of the 67th year of the constitutional era, all of the important people with foresight in the Federation felt the importance of unity. President Pabre's administration undoubtedly ushered in the most beautiful beginning. Amidst the resounding applause, excited shouts, and happy whistles, Mr. Pabre, the president-elect of the Federation, accompanied by his wife and President Sig, slowly walked from the side to the stone steps of the Parliament building. This was the first time Pabre stood at the highest point of the Federation, but this lawyer-turned-politician did not panic at all. He shook hands with President Sig, smiled, and whispered a few words, and then walked to the front of the oath stage. The sea of people in the square at the foot of the Parliament building immediately became even more excited, and the guests on the viewing platform also began to extremely politely applaud. President Pabre was born into a family of miners in the Donglin district. His difficult childhood and later arduous military career left behind dark marks on his face full of perseverance, and his 10 years of work as a public interest lawyer allowed his thick lips to say countless words that would make the hearts of the audience swoon. However, today, President Pabre said nothing. He only raised both of his arms, and raised them high towards the people in the square who passionately supported him. Gradually, the square became quiet. President Pabre narrowed his eyes and watched the dense crowd. He turned his head to look at his wife, who had hot tears in her eyes, and then looked at his election partner, Vice President Byron. He cast a slightly simple and honest smile, and then turned his head back. After the collapse of the dynasty in the distant past, human society entered the stage of electoral politics. No matter how the name of society changed, whether it was the Republic or the Federation, but after so many years, only this presidential election gave the Federation people a very different feeling. Because in this presidential election, two outliers, Senator Pabre and Senator Macklin, had appeared. In countless years of elections, there had never been a story of a person without any family background, starting from the bottom of society, and standing on the glorious stage of Federation politics in one fell swoop. But this time, two people had appeared at once. President Pabre quietly looked at the people below the stage, and a trace of a smile appeared on his face. The wrinkles on his lips became very deep, as if they were carved with a knife. They were firm and gave people a feeling of trust. There were many people in the Federation who passionately supported him, at least not less than Macklin's support. However, in the election, this politician had always calmly controlled the emotions of his supporters, and in order to not let the Federation fall into chaos, he had carried out countless difficult and even somewhat passive efforts. However, reality proved that he was the final victor. My victory is the victory of the common people. President Pabre looked at the crowd below the stone steps and suddenly laughed loudly. His laughter was exceptionally free and unrestrained. After the laughter gradually stopped, he extended his right index finger and pointed at the people who were full of joyful smiles. His palm was broad and thick, and his fingers were slender and strong. He loudly said, "It is your victory. The victory of the common people, your victory." In the Winter Capital Special District, on Parliament Hill, Charter Square, the Lawn, the Calm Lake, and every corner of the Federation, the miners who had been guarding the resource planet for several years, the warriors patrolling the border, the students in the dormitory, and all kinds of people were excited by these words. The cheers resounded in front of Parliament Hill, and the sound was deafening. Behind the oath-taking platform, the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, who was in charge of presiding over today's oath-taking ceremony, opened his sleepy eyes, as if he did not know what had happened. In an extremely inconspicuous position in the second-to-last row of the viewing platform, Lady Ty, wearing a black imitation leather coat, calmly looked at the president in the distance. She covered her mouth with her gloved right hand and coughed softly a few times. Hearing the cheers around her, she unnoticeably frowned. "This is the victory of the common people. This is your victory." On the news screen in the office, President Pabre was loudly saying these words. There was a sea of people in the square, and it was a magnificent sight. The white-haired Senator Macklin had a haggard expression on his face, but when he saw this scene, he could not help but laugh mockingly. He softly said, "An eloquent speaker who uses the common people as his clothes." As the loser of the presidential election, Macklin was not too dissatisfied to be able to escape unscathed. His haggard expression mainly came from waking up early that morning and the current situation he was in. This senator, who was highly respected by the people at the bottom of the Federation, wore a white shirt that was dyed with black and yellow spots. There was also a lingering stench that seeped out of his body. The news on the television continued. Not far away, the dense gunshots continued to sound, chilling to the heart. Senator Macklin's face was a little pale. He took a wet towel and wiped the dirt and dust on his body in disgust. Although his residence was behind the office, and there was a huge shower and the most luxurious wave jacuzzi, as the target of an assassination, he really did not have the mood or time to enjoy these things amidst the roaring gunshots. "We have to leave immediately, Mr. Senator," Macklin's confidential secretary said with a pale face and a trembling voice. "Since the other party can even blow up the escape tunnel, they must be a very large organization. Maybe they are people from the mountains. We don't know if the Federal Army will come to help. The security forces in the building alone will definitely not be able to withstand it." The moment the alarm sounded, the staff in the senator's office helped Senator Macklin, who had woken up early, into the secret tunnel and prepared to leave directly into the underground parking lot. However, no one expected that just as they were about to walk out of the secret tunnel, there would be a terrifying explosion above the tunnel. The power of the explosion directly collapsed the top of the tunnel, and 7 staff members in the senator's office died in the rubble. It was the cautious Senator Macklin who had deliberately waited until the end, and he managed to escape with his life. However, the dust, feces, and urine that were blasted out by the explosion still drenched the people who were lucky enough to escape with their lives. Senator Macklin frowned and glanced at his secretary. He thought of his secretary, Helen, and felt even more dissatisfied. However, Helen had already been killed by him in the terrorist attack, so there was no benefit in reminiscing about her past. The senator wiped his white hair with a wet towel and threw the smelly towel on the ground. He turned back to look at the strong soldier beside the chair and asked in a low voice, "How long until the helicopter arrives?" "The intruders are too fast. Even if the military receives the order to request for help, it will take at least 20 minutes. The soldier did not have an epaulet and did not belong to any department of the Federation government. He was Senator Macklin's most trusted subordinate, and had been Macklin's orderly many years ago. Later on, he began to lead the armed forces in the building to protect Senator Macklin's career in this universe. What do you suggest? Although Senator Macklin was in a sorry state, he still managed to maintain a calm expression. The continuous gunshots and the occasional explosion not far away could not make the weather-beaten old man panic. "There are not many intruders. The internal surveillance confirmed that only one person entered the building, the soldier said in a low voice. One person. Macklin's brows furrowed, and he snapped rudely, "How is the safety work done? It's my fault. However, there is a very powerful sniper on the peak in the northeast." The soldier replied quickly and calmly, "Whether we evacuate from the ground now or wait for the helicopter to leave, it will be very dangerous. The sniper must be waiting for this moment. The Federal Army's conventional sniper weapons can't have such a long range." He continued to analyze. "I think it's an experimental ACW. Senator, I suggest that we stay in the building and wait for reinforcements." According to the feedback from the communication device, the reinforcements outside the building have rushed over. Since there is only one person, it is impossible for him to break into this room in front of our security forces. Then how did he break into the building? The secretary retorted sharply, and then suggested to the senator in a trembling voice, "That person must have other helpers. Mr. Senator, let's retreat first. Since the sniper outside has been exposed, the Special Task Force must be dealing with him now." The Special Task Force's response can't be slow, but it will take some time for the people to deal with the sniper to arrive. The key is, can those agents handle it? The soldier glanced at the secretary and saluted Senator Macklin. "Comrade Senator, please believe in our strength and determination. There is a safe house in the office, and this is the safest place." "Okay." Senator Macklin did not think for long and agreed to the arrangement. He slowly sat back on the soft sofa and watched the presidential inauguration ceremony on the television tiredly. He said slowly, "Are you confident?" "Yes." The soldier said calmly, "That person has been surrounded at the entrance of the 3 eastern districts. Everyone is rushing over. Even if he is Li Pifu, only death awaits him today." After the first round of shooting, Shi Qinghai carried the heavy ACW and its accessories, stepped on the red leaves, and rushed to the foot of the mountain. He knew that his position had been exposed, and the enemy would definitely come to suppress him immediately. However, the reason he rushed down the mountain was not to change his sniping position, but to change his role in the plan today. He wanted to provide as much effective support as possible to Madman Su in the building. Breathing heavily and with heavy footsteps, Shi Qinghai ran all the way. He knew very well that the ACW in his hand could not determine the outcome of the battle, just like how the new MX Mecha could not determine the outcome of the war between the Federation and the Empire. The agents of the Special Task Force were originally used to block bullets for important political figures. How could they be blocked by an anti-material rifle? Previously, Shi Qinghai's shooting at the top of the mountain had stopped the Special Task Force for 2 minutes. This was taking advantage of the mutual distrust between Senator Macklin's office and the government. However, only the commander of the Special Task Force would come to his senses and realize that he had failed in his duty. He would definitely rush to the building at all costs. The development of the facts was just as Shi Qinghai expected. The shadow of death could not stop the Special Task Force. When he rushed down the mountain, more than a dozen agents of the Special Task Force had already rushed into the building fearlessly, ready to block Su Li's escape route. The staff of the security company also rushed in with the Special Task Force. Shi Qinghai rushed to the foot of the mountain. He listened attentively to the gunshots in the building. His heart gradually became heavy, because the obvious muffled sound of the Cayenne gun had stopped, but the gunshots of the enemy were getting more and more frequent. After entering a suitable distance, Shi Qinghai reinstalled the ACW and pulled the trigger. The thick barrel had no fire, only smoke. 2 smoke bombs with long tails penetrated the glass wall of the 3 eastern districts of the Foundation building and fell in. Chapter 296. The dark ventilation duct was full of dust, and gunshots rang out from time to time. Several holes were shot in the metal ventilation wall, and thin pillars of white light shone in. It looked like an unreal scene. Sulu dragged his travel bag and crawled in the ventilation duct. The design of the ventilation duct of the foundation building was very strong, and it would never give intruders any chance to escape. Although the cautious Senator Macklin was no longer the tough soldier he used to be, he was very mature when it came to security. Warm blood flowed out from the wound, bringing with it dust, turning into a sticky substance, making people feel very uncomfortable. Sulu breathed in the stale air and crawled quickly in the ventilation duct. He did not care about his wound and the pursuit that might be caused by the sound. In fact, he was still hiding in the 3 eastern districts and could not get rid of the omnipresent gunfire. In fact, he did not want to get rid of it, nor did he want to leave. He jumped down from the ventilation duct and landed on his left leg first. A sharp pain entered his brain and almost made him fall to the ground. This was the pantry of the office area, and no one was there for the time being. Sulu sat down by the coffee machine and lowered his head to breathe quickly. Only then did he have a chance to see where he was shot. Earlier, he had been ambushed by the powerful armed men around Macklin in the 3rd East District. Then, the Special Task Force agents and more than 30 security guards from the security company rushed into the building and surrounded him. If he hadn't thrown the 4 rolling grenades and caused temporary chaos, he wouldn't have been able to escape from that place. Did he leave? No, the outside of the room was full of heavily armed enemies. As soon as he showed his head, he would definitely end up in a honeycomb. After a short breath, Sulu felt that in addition to the wound on his left leg, there were also 2 painful places on his body. He looked down and saw that the trousers on his left leg had been completely torn, and a piece of shrapnel had cut directly under his knee. If it had been a little higher, his knee would have been shot, and it would have been difficult for him to walk. He was shot twice in the chest and abdomen, and the conical bullets were deeply embedded in the interlayer of his underwear. The huge impact compressed the 2 bullets and made them look like round platinum nails used by girls for decoration. Sulu frowned and used all his strength to pull them down. He found that the place where he was shot was extremely painful. He didn't know if his ribs were broken. If it hadn't been for the thin, hard bulletproof vest from Whitewater Company, he would have already met George Carlin. Escaping from death, he didn't feel much joy. His heart was heavy. He took a deep breath and mobilized the scorching power behind his waist, causing his body to tremble. Especially around his injured left leg, the muscle fibers were forcefully squeezing and rubbing together, increasing the pain of the wound. Blood also spurted out, but for some reason, the wound gradually turned white, and no more blood flowed out. At this time, a very soft sound suddenly came from outside the pantry. Sulu clenched the cayenne in his hand and lowered his head to listen attentively. Although he couldn't confirm the number of people, he knew that it was definitely not a small number. He slowly lowered his body. Instead of hiding behind the door, he squatted on the other side of the door. Sure enough, there was a burst of concentrated gunfire. The high-density plastic door was instantly shot with countless holes by the gunfire outside the door, splashing wood and plastic shards everywhere. Sulu silently squatted at the bottom of the door, avoiding the spurting bullets and risking his life to wait. After the door was kicked open, Sulu didn't care about the first person with a gun at all. Instead, he flashed out from behind that person, raised his gun, and fired continuously, killing the 2 people in front of him. In the shortest amount of time, he threw himself under a cubicle desk. Just as he fell heavily to the ground, gunshots rang out in the office in the East 3rd District. A barrage of bullets rained down on his hiding spot. The bullets shattered the small decorations on top of the cubicle. The small crystal objects and dolls that the ladies liked to put in the office experienced a second brutal blow and were scattered in all directions. The light blue hard partition material, under such intense gunfire, gradually fell apart. Fortunately, it wasn't made of tofu slag. Although it didn't play a big role, it still resisted for a while. During this time, Su Lu silently crawled toward the window in the smoke and gunfire. From the moment he rushed into the building, he had already put life and death behind him. But at this moment, accompanied by the shrill gunfire and the cold metal music, he really smelled the smell of death. Motherf ****. At this time, he couldn't raise his head at all. The whistling sound of the bullets around him mixed together and became a horrible sound. The hard objects that kept shattering around him reminded him that the human body couldn't withstand this kind of harvest of death. His mood was extremely cold and gloomy. He didn't even notice that the bullets that were shooting around once again hit his thigh. At this time, the floor-to-ceiling glass curtain of the 3 eastern districts suddenly broke. 2 metal objects flew in, instantly releasing a large amount of smoke that quickly enveloped the entire floor. Then 2 more smoke bombs were shot in, and the smoke became thicker. Even the things that were close to him couldn't be seen clearly. The dense gunfire that was moving in this direction suddenly became fierce and then sparse. Everyone in the office temporarily stayed in their positions and didn't move. The federal military provided a smoke bomb. Under the cover of the smoke, Su Lu quietly moved his position and hid behind a safe with a pale face. With the knowledge of guns he learned from Magnolia, he easily recognized what it was that allowed him to live for a few more minutes. He knew that there was someone covering him outside the Foundation building, but it was not Secretary Bai. However, the effect of the smoke bomb could only last for 3 minutes. The well-trained security personnel in the building obviously knew this, so they didn't rush blindly. Instead, they occupied all the corridors and coldly waited for the smoke to disperse. Only 3 minutes to live? Su Lu took a few quick breaths, lowered his head and wiped the blood on his face. He gently put the Cayenne in his hand on the ground, took out the last 2 long pistols from the travel bag, and then slowly and steadily began to install the silencer. The biggest reason why today's operation was in such a precarious situation was because the Magnolia in the mountain had failed to successfully control the monitoring system in the Golden Foundation building again. Without the help of the monitoring system, Su Lu was equivalent to a blind man, and the other party could clearly find his location. At this time, the smoke was extremely thick, and everyone became blind for 3 minutes. But what would happen after 3 minutes? Su Lu lowered his head and pursed his dry lip. His eyes narrowed, and there was a strange smile on his face. He didn't want to think about what would happen after 3 minutes. Uncle said that humans are the best machines. He wiped the cold sweat from his palms, took a deep breath, and tightly held the cold long handle of the pistol. He kept muttering to himself in his heart, "Su Lu, you are a machine. You won't get hurt, you won't get tired." This was probably self-hypnosis when facing a desperate situation. Only in this difficult and dangerous environment would he not lose the last of his courage and confidence. However, no matter how much he hypnotized himself, he knew that his eyesight and hearing were better than the average person, but after all, he was not the omniscient and omnipotent creator, and he was not the eyes that could look down on all living beings. The people surrounding him were all well-trained professional soldiers and professional agents of the Special Task Force. He couldn't kill them with just the smoke. But he still had to stand up and finish this matter. So, Su Lu frowned and tried not to think about the miserable wounds on his body. He exerted strength in his waist and abdomen, preparing to stand up and continue shooting. Then, he would be shot until he died. In the capital special district, in front of the Parliament Hill, countless people quietly watched the long stone steps on the oath platform with eyes full of concern. At this time, no one noticed that in the second last row of the viewing platform, there was a lady in a black coat. She received a phone call, and then a strange look flashed through her calm expression. In the same inconspicuous position of the viewing platform, the heads of the Li family and the Lin family, who deliberately kept a low profile at this prominent moment, seemed to have received some kind of message at the same time. The expressions on their faces changed, and then they immediately returned to normal. They looked at the stone steps seriously. "I solemnly swear that I will faithfully carry out the duties of the President and use all my strength to protect the Charter of the Federation." Vice President Byron had finished his oath. At this time, the one who put his hand on the thick charter was President-elect Pabre. His voice was very stable, and his feelings were sincere. What followed was a 10-minute speech. "On this day we are gathered together because we choose hope over fear, and meaningful unity over disputes and discord. On this day we have come to declare that those useless complaints and false promises have come to an end. Those mutual accusations and old dogmas that have warped our politics for a long time have come to an end." President Pabre used a grave expression to watch the crowd in the square. "Under the threat of the empire, under the threat of the Federation's unfairness, should we sit and wait for the judgment of the Creator, or should we do our best to do something? In the history of the Federation, there has never been a lack of people who have pleaded for the people. And in the history of the Federation, in the face of the dark era and decadent oppression, there have always been people who dared to stand up and release their own roar. I admire this type of person. I want to tell these people that no matter where you are in the universe, as long as you respect the principles of the Federation and the spirit of the Charter, I welcome you to S1, to the capital, to the Federation government." Sulu didn't hear the content of President Pabre's speech. In the smoke and ruins, he prepared to stand up, but his pupils suddenly shrank, as if he saw something inconceivable. Chapter 297. That autumn more than 2 years ago, Uncle Fong Yu had put that bracelet on Su Li's wrist. From then on, many strange things had happened to him. He had swapped out the chip on the back of his neck. He had entered the black dream while unconscious, and in the dream, he had seen that great and terrifying existence. That existence had not erased his existence, but had instead been silently watching over him. Furthermore, at the crucial moment when he was fighting for the laboratory data, he had helped him. The Federal Central Computer, which had distributed the glory of the Charter, had once injected countless complex and advanced blueprints into his brain in order to awaken him from his coma. It was also by relying on these blueprints that Su Lu had been able to enter the Shell Motor Company, and had played an important role in the Federation's development of the new MX mecha. Su Lu had asked himself countless times, why would such a bizarre encounter that only appeared in novels, a storyline that no one had ever imagined, happen to him? At first, he had been terrified, worried that the Federal Central Computer would recognize his identity as a fugitive and kill him at every moment. Later on, he had become numb and lost, and had some thoughts of throwing caution to the wind. His courage and directness in dealing with the things and people around him probably had something to do with this absolute sense of insecurity. After that, he had gotten used to the black dream that had appeared in his mind. That extremely polite old thing had spoken in a flat tone, and he had vaguely caught onto something. For some unknown reason, the cornerstone of the Federation Society, the glory of the Charter, which had spread throughout the universe, did not seem to want him to die. At least, he could not die now. Therefore, before he had come to S2 to do the most important thing in his life, he had mustered up the courage to initiate contact with the other end of the black dream. The other end of the black dream had reacted to him, but there had been no result. It was not until he had entered the interior of the Golden Foundation building, running for his life amidst the hail of bullets, that the great existence had once again appeared in his mind, in front of his eyes, by his side, and the moment it had appeared, it had given him endless shock. The architectural blueprints that appeared in Su Li's eyes did not shock him. The database of the Federation's central computer contained all the details of this world. Furthermore, he had long been used to the scene in front of his eyes. The more complicated architectural designs in the past also abruptly appeared in front of his eyes like this. Now, he naturally understood that this was not because he had epilepsy, nor was it because the bioelectric current in the chip behind his neck was disrupted. Instead, it was because the omnipotent central computer of the Federation was inputting data to him. What shocked him was the light spots in the blueprints, as well as the long series of citizen numbers on the light spots. Each light spot represented a person in the building. If one focused on the light spots would become clearer, revealing the outline of the human body. One could clearly see the location of the person and their movement. From this detail, it could be determined that not only did the Federal Central Computer use the chip to locate the specific location of everyone in the room, but it also directly used the highest authority to take over the Golden Foundation's internal monitoring network. What did this mean? This meant that at this time, Su Lu could clearly grasp every detail of the environment around him through his own eyes. The 3 eastern districts of the office were full of thick fog, reducing the visibility to the lowest level. Even if he used the infrared thermal imaging device equipped by the military, he was afraid that it would not be able to quickly distinguish between friend and foe. At this time, the blueprints in his eyes that could change at will and the light spots that represented the enemy seemed to have given him a pair of eyes that could see through the fog, even the walls and camouflage. In the world of the Federation, no one could escape the glory of the Charter. At this time, the glory of the Charter bathed Su Li's body. It was as if he had gained a pair of omniscient and omnipotent eyes that could overlook the world from space, capturing every detail and every target. Su Li's body felt a burst of coldness and an incomparably complicated heat. These two completely different emotions intertwined in his heart. He should have been incomparably excited because he had a perspective and ability that no one else in the universe could have, but he also felt endless fear. Why would the Federation's central computer grant him such terrifying authority and ability? What was hidden behind this matter? He had a pair of eyes that could see through everything and control everything. Could he still be considered a human? At the moment of life and death, even the cold and fear disappeared in an instant. With the blessing of the glory of the Charter, with such a pair of eyes that could see through everything, he might not have to die now and could finish the task at hand. Thinking of this, Su Li's whole body was hot and his face was pale. His narrowed eyes narrowed slightly as he stared at the empty fog in front of him. His body trembled slightly. In the heavy fog, he stood up, quietly and slowly took off his shoes, stepped on the debris on the ground, and walked into the depths of the fog. It was not his eyes that could see through all obstacles, heaven and earth, but the three-dimensional map in his left eye. With his subtle movements, the map that appeared in his left eye made subtle adjustments to its perspective, and the virtual blueprints were perfectly consistent with the surrounding environment in reality. To be able to achieve real-time data synchronization and scene reproduction, probably only the omnipresent and omnipotent Federal Central Computer could do it, right? His left eye clearly showed the number of enemies and their positions, and even their movements were clearly displayed. Su Lu narrowed his eyes, put a pistol back on his waist, and held the long pistol flat with both hands. He slowly moved and aimed at a point in the depths of the fog. There was dead silence all around. No one knew the position of each other. The very military people did not shoot randomly, but silently blocked all the passages, waiting for the moment when the fog dissipated. The security personnel of the Foundation would never have thought that Su Lu had stood up at this time. Su Lu silently aimed at the depths of the fog. The cold muzzle pointed at the chaos, and nothing could be seen clearly. However, in his left eye, there was a virtual human body that could not be clearer. That person was holding a long gun and vigilantly leaning against a corner of the wall. Su Lu pulled the trigger in his hand, and his wrist trembled slightly. The gun barrel made a very low chirping sound, and the bullet shot into the depths of the fog. There was still the sound of cement fragments and plastic fragments falling around, and there was a subtle breathing sound. The light of the light tube above could not penetrate the thick fog, and it was very vague. The gunshot after the noise was suppressed, and in this dangerous environment, it was very difficult to attract people's attention. The bullet shot into the depths of the fog, like a clay ox entering the sea, and there was no reaction. Sulu narrowed his eyes, but from the light in his left eyelid, he could clearly see that the person's forehead had been hit with a warm color. He leaned against the wall with his head tilted and did not move at all. He should be dead. He died silently, and only the row of citizen numbers above his head gradually dissipated and went with the wind. Su Li's pupils shrunk helplessly. In this situation, he actually felt a sense of helplessness. It had to be said that it was a very strange thing. He did not have any further reaction to the unreal feeling that was similar to a game. Instead, he relied on his strong and thick nerves to silently and slowly turn around again. He pointed the muzzle at another direction in the depths of the fog. He silently pulled the trigger again, and another life quietly left the depths of the fog. The fog could last for about 2 minutes, and there were still more than 20 militants hidden in the 3 eastern districts. The thick white fog looked like beautiful white clouds floating on the mountainside. It covered the top of the autumn forest and the living creatures in the forest. The clouds, the fog, and the sky could no longer cover Su Li's eyes. He walked into the depths of the fog without making a single sound. He was like a barefoot shepherd boy walking among the white clouds in the mountains. However, this shepherd boy did not harvest grass or feed cows. He harvested lives for the sake of stubbornly moving forward. This was a completely unequal and unfair one-sided killing. After losing by Yulan's instructions through the earpiece, Su Lu became a blind man. Under the tracking of the Golden Foundation's internal surveillance network, he was in a very sorry state and even miserable state as he constantly fled. He was like a mouse caught by countless stray cats. No matter how he struggled, he would still end up dead in the end. But at this time, his eyes saw light again, and what he saw was great light. He could see everything around him, but nothing around him could see his true appearance. In the cloud-like fog, he walked barefoot. Every time he stepped on the ground, he was extremely careful and did not make the slightest sound. Even if he stepped on a few sharp fragments and blood began to flow from the soles of his feet, he only frowned slightly and did not have the slightest reaction. The 2 gunshot wounds on his legs also affected his speed and pace. Relying on his superhuman muscle strength and control, he dragged his injured leg and silently and valiantly walked into the depths of the fog. He raised his gun and looked straight ahead, silently firing, and killed the enemies hidden in the fog, in the corners, and next to the file cabinets one by one. After Su Lu shot and killed 6 people, the rest of the people in the 3 eastern districts finally felt a trace of strangeness and a chill from the depths of their hearts. They did not know that many of their companions had quietly died, but the faint smell of blood that was faintly getting stronger and stronger, the occasional sound of touching, and the occasional soft chirping from time to time made them faintly guess what was going on. The highly trained militants and the Special Task Force agents, who were responsible for the security of VIPs, realized that there was a huge problem with the situation at the scene almost at the same time. Almost at the same time, they could no longer bear the feeling of impending death in the silence. They chose the most dangerous, but also the most courageous and most effective method. After confirming each other's positions briefly with the internal communication device, the gunshots in the 3 eastern districts exploded in an instant. Dense bullets once again flew in the air, weaving into countless firepower nets that shrouded the entire area. After the silence was broken, there were muffled grunts, screams, and hurried calls. This place became a noisy and dangerous battlefield. They no longer cared about whether or not they would cause serious injuries. They only hoped that with their lives, they could take down the terrifying intruder hidden in the fog. In just a moment, several armed militants were killed or injured by their own gunfire. Just before the gunfire erupted again, Sulu lowered his body in advance through the omniscient and omnipotent vision of his left eye. He dragged his heavily injured leg and quickly made his way to the left side of the fog. He was sure that there were no enemies here, and there was a safe here. He shrank his body behind the safe and held the gun with his head down. He listened to the whistling sound of bullets in the air in front of him and felt the environment around him where hard objects were scattered. He maintained absolute silence. The great light in his left eye could see the figures who raised their guns and fired into the fog. He could see where they were aiming, so in this chaotic and dangerous shooting, he was not hit. However, there were still a few high-speed bullets that swept in front of him, splashing the carpet fragments on the ground and the cement debris under the carpet, making crackling sound. After silently counting 10 seconds, Sulu raised his head that had been buried deep in his arms. He narrowed his eyes and aimed at a certain spot in the fog in front of him. He held the long case pistol with both hands to maintain absolute stability. Control the entrance of the passage. Give feedback on the situation. A cold voice came from the fog. The owner of the voice hid his body behind the fog and the desk, extremely cautious. Sulu narrowed his eyes and aimed at that spot. That spot was covered in fog, but his left eye had already seen through the smoke and the partition of the desk, accurately capturing the location of the other party. He gently pulled the trigger, and the bullet penetrated the smoke and the partition, accurately hitting the person's throat. Blood burst out of the person's throat, but Sulu only saw a warm color in a certain area with his left eye. The 3 eastern districts once again fell into a dead silence. The people's breathing became heavy, and they no longer deliberately suppressed it. This was because they found that no matter how they hid, it seemed that the intruder could find their location and kill them. In this dead silence, Sulu quietly moved toward one of the 2 exits under the cover of the fog. What the hell? In the temporary security command center in the auxiliary building of the Cultural and Arts Center, the captain of the Special Task Force of the Federation stared at the surveillance screen with a pale face, his tightly clenched fists trembling slightly. 7 surveillance cameras faithfully displayed everything that happened in the 3 eastern districts in front of his eyes. The problem was that all he could see at this time was only smoke. He could only hear the gunshots in the smoke and the sounds of all the combatants on his side dying. After all, the Peace Foundation was not a federal military base, and the Federation government would not give the building the authority to install a thermal imaging system. Even if there was, this member of the Special Task Force knew that at most he could see vague red and yellow figures in the smoke, but he could not distinguish between friend and foe. How did the intruder do it? At this time, he saw a picture from the corner of his eye. The door of the second exit of the 3 eastern districts flashed, and a guy in a guard uniform with a seriously injured left leg slowly walked out. Although this guy was not carrying the travel bag, the captain of the Special Task Force still recognized him at a glance. His pupils shrank slightly. Since this guy walked out of the smoke, what about the people in the smoke? The target is at the second exit. He forcibly suppressed the coldness and fear in his heart, stared at Sulu on the screen, and quickly issued an order. Block the front of the corridor and flank from the side. Then the captain of the Special Task Force saw a scene that had frightened him for many years. Chapter 298. The existence and the glory of the Charter didn't help Sulu enter the Federation's Special Task Force's communication channel, so he didn't hear the orders of the Special Task Force officer. He knew that security personnel would appear at the end of the side corridor, but he could see them. At this time, the walls and rooms inside the Foundation building had disappeared in his eyes. His left eye saw rows of virtual 3-dimensional images. He could see the enemies running wildly behind the walls. Those figures condensed from light spots were turning back from behind the walls, trying to kill him from the side. Sulu turned around and raised his gun, aiming at the side exit in advance. The The running speed of the people behind the walls made it easy for him to calculate when they would appear. 3, 2, 1. He pulled the trigger in his hand. The moment the 3 enemies appeared at the end of the corridor, the bullets arrived. 3 flowers of blood bloomed, and the 3 people's bodies leaned back violently and fell heavily to the ground. After doing this thing that shouldn't be possible for humans, Sulu dragged his seriously injured leg and walked forward. If he were an ordinary person with 2 bullets in the leg, he would have been unable to move long ago. But he was not an ordinary person, and the scene that happened before proved this. He just lowered his head, changed the magazine, and prepared for the next shot like a ghost. Walking through the dark corridor, he couldn't feel hesitant. Even if he had an indescribable feeling of confusion and fear about what happened to him, he was as careless and determined as ever. The moment he lowered his head and walked, he found that the road under his feet was more difficult than before, but also more comfortable. At this time, there was nothing that could stop his strong desire to finish this thing. He raised his hand and fired at will in the corridor, and the bullets were unrestrained, shooting down the people in front of him one by one. He walked straight forward without any worries. The world of freedom in his heart was not clear and lofty, but it was extraordinarily firm, blooming like a blood-colored flower that would never wither. In the 4 States Peace Foundation building, who knew how many blood-colored flowers bloomed? Sulu, dragging his injured leg, killed a bloody path and came to the outside of the room with the door closed. The image in his left eye flashed slightly, and it showed that there were 3 people in the room. One of them had just stood up from the sofa, and the citizen number above that person's head started with SLB looked very familiar. Although the Federation strictly protected the privacy of its citizens, this citizen number was no secret to Sulu. SL represented the Upper Forest region, while B represented S2. This person was Macklin. He was still in the room. It seemed that after the secret passage was blown up, Sulu's speed of breaking through the 3 eastern regions was too fast, so this counselor did not seize the opportunity to leave. What a fool! Sulu sniffled and licked his dry lips. He raised the pistol in his hand and rested it on his wrist. He aimed behind the door and gently knocked on it. He stood in a very good position. He knew what the people behind the door were doing, and he also knew that there were still some security personnel who were trying to save Macklin's life. So he knocked on the door. As long as the person behind the door was a little further away from the wall, he could pull the trigger and directly kill that person. But it was clear that the bodyguard who was still with the counselor at the last moment was a very vigilant guy. Probably that person also knew that Sulu seemed to have some kind of strange ability, so he hid his body perfectly behind the wall and did not give Sulu any chance to shoot through. He's outside. The soldier with a cold expression leaned against the wall and said to Macklin, who was at the door of the office, "Counselor, you must go in immediately and close the safe house." Macklin's white hair was messy on the top of his head. The old politician silently looked at his most trusted subordinate, walked into the bedroom without hesitation, and pressed the button next to him. The sound of heavy components closing faintly came from behind the door. Sulu's thick eyebrows twitched. He knew what this meant. In the original plan, he did not expect to be able to do anything before the counselor hid in the safe house. But the clear sound of metal components closing still caused small bumps to appear on his back. He raised the gun and fired 3 shots at the lock of the door at a speed that did not match the rhythm. After a slight pause, he kicked the door open, threw his body forward, and rushed in. Before he broke the door, he had already determined the location of that person. While he was in the air, the barrel in his right hand had already opened fire, shooting at the wall on the right. The soldier who had been standing silently behind the wall was still silent and indifferent. Both sides were tightly holding an old-fashioned pistol. There was no epaulet on his shoulder, and there was a sharp military knife at his waist. His eyes were calm as he looked in the direction of the door. the most trusted bodyguard of Macklin, was able to break through the layers of defense inside the foundation building. He knew very well that today's intruder was not an ordinary person, so he was fully prepared. He was even prepared for failure. Therefore, when the door was kicked open, he immediately fired a shot. His body, however, turned around at an incredible speed. The barrel of the old-fashioned pistol spewed out beautiful flames, shooting at the black shadow that broke through the door. Puff, 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 the sound of gunshots intertwined and resounded in the luxurious office. Dust and debris flew everywhere, and bullet holes were clearly visible on the walls and the floor. Before the smoke accumulated in the deep holes could rise, the two figures had already wrestled together like two fierce tigers. Sulu did not hit the soldier without epaulet. The soldier had experienced countless life-and-death gunfights in his life. Although he had the help of the glory of the Charter, which gave him unparalleled vision and predictive ability, at the critical moment of life and death, the silent soldier smelled danger in advance. Relying on a soldier's instinct on the battlefield, he reacted and narrowly avoided the soldier's continuous shot. The soldier also did not hit Sulu. Although his evaluation of this intruder had risen to terrifying, he still did not expect that an injured person could actually react like a human when he was about to land on the ground. The moment Sulu landed on the floor, his left palm slammed down fiercely. Relying on the huge force of the rebound, his body was forcibly shaken and bounced forward in the air. The soldier's bullets all brushed past his body and hit the floor. The soldier's pupils shrank sharply. At this moment, he thought of his previous suggestion to the committee member. At that time, he thought that in the encirclement of the 3 eastern districts, even if the Lees of Philadelphia personally came, it would be impossible to break through alone. However, this small-eyed man did it, without any hesitation. The soldier without epaulets rushed over with a solemn face. His left hand clasped Su Li's right hand that was holding the gun, and his right hand holding the gun pressed against Su Li's abdomen. At this time, Su Li's left hand had already fiercely grabbed the soldier's right shoulder, and the long magazine pistol in his right hand immediately fired. All of this happened in the blink of an eye. The two of them used their excellent military qualities to spring up and fight each other, twisting their bodies together. The soldier ignored the gun in Su Li's hand and bravely chose to die together with him. When people were not afraid of death, there were too many methods that could not be used. Sulu, whose right hand was tightly grabbed, passively accepted the other party's invitation to die. He did not have time to think about anything else and subconsciously pulled the trigger. One was muffled, the other was crisp. 2 gunshots sounded almost at the same time, bursting out from the two people's chest and abdomen. The gunfire suddenly burst out in the narrow space. At such a close range, there was no way for anyone to dodge the shot. It was as if there were 2 very strong ropes tied around the waists of Sulu and the soldier. The air in the office instantly froze, and the 2 people's bodies suddenly stopped. Then, they were hit by the huge impact of the bullet and were pushed back rapidly. The bullet hit the hard ceramic bulletproof vest, and it was unknown if it had penetrated it. The pale-faced Sulu did not care about that. He even suppressed the huge pain in that area and the urge to vomit blood that was beginning to accumulate in his chest. The moment he fell, his right foot hooked the soldier's ankle, and he forcefully bounced up again. He fiercely used his knee to hit the soldier's knee. With a cracking sound, the soldier's knee broke. But the soldier's eyes lit up. He did not care about Su Li's violent and ruthless hand skills in a small area. His left hand shot out like lightning and firmly gripped the back of Su Li's neck. The barrel of his right hand was slanted upwards, pointing at the soldier's chin. Both parties were extremely cautious in wearing bulletproof vests. At the beginning, the violent shooting at each other at close range could not completely knock them down. But at such a close range, if someone were to shoot at the neck, no one would be able to survive. At this time, Su Lu had already dropped the gun in his hand. There were no more bullets in the gun. He used the bend of his elbow to hit the soldier's collarbone. At the same time, he used the fastest speed to pull out the military knife that he had not used before. The all-black long-case pistol fell on the floor with a bang. The two people who were tangled together in a dangerous situation also fell heavily to the ground. Like a flash of light, Su Lu roared. His right hand tightly gripped the military knife and viciously stabbed at the soldier's heart from above. The soldier used his uninjured right leg to hold Su Li's body tightly. The muzzle of his right hand was in an extremely narrow range, pointing at the soldier's chin. A flash of light flashed in his eyes. It was the reflection of the military knife. He was not afraid at all. Because he was wearing a soft pottery bulletproof vest, it was enough to withstand the explosive strike of such a sharp cold weapon. Even if it could not block it, so what? If I die, you will die too. The soldier without the epaulets was very willing to use his own life to exchange for the other's life. After the flash of light in his eyes, there was a look of determination and relief. The sharp military knife pierced through the soldier's uniform and opened a small hole in the soft pottery bulletproof vest. It encountered an extremely strong resistance. It was like a bamboo pole that was stuck in a quagmire that was about to freeze in the winter. It was difficult to move forward, but it also could not be pulled out. The soldier's finger was already ready to pull the trigger. He was ready to see the flash of gunfire in front of his eyes and smash the head of the silent, small-eyed man into pieces. Su Li's eyes were especially bright at this moment. They were squinting like the crescent moon. The sound of electric current was heard. The blue arc flashed at the front of the military knife. A look of disbelief flashed in the soldier's eyes. His finger on the cold trigger kept trembling, but he could not press it down no matter what. At the same time, his body began to tremble violently. A faint burnt smell filled the room. The valiant professional soldier, Su Lu, who had powerful abilities, did not faint from the electric current. After a moment, the two people gradually regained control of their bodies. At this most critical moment, Su Li's face was abnormally pale. His eyes were abnormally bright. He extracted all of the strength in his body and transferred it to his limbs. He forced half of his body to stretch out. He used his elbow to remove the gun barrel that was pressed against his chin. His left hand pressed on his right wrist. Ah! He let out a fierce shout as he stared at the unfamiliar face of the soldier below him. He exerted all the strength in his body, transferring it from his hands to the sharp military knife in his hand. The military knife slowly broke through the soft pottery bulletproof vest. It sank down bit by bit, pierced the skin, pierced the flesh, slid past the ribs, pierced the joints, and slowly pierced into the smooth surface of the heart. The soldier without epaulets stared at the young man's face in front of him. He opened his mouth and wanted to make some sound, but could only make these unconscious sounds. He felt like there was a huge mountain pressing on his body. He felt like his sternum was all broken. He also felt like there was a fine needle gently pricking his skin. With a poochie sound, all the sharp military thorns pierced into his heart. The soldier's body trembled violently. Su Lu lowered his head and pressed on the soldier's body, desperately suppressing the tremors. In the end, there was no more reaction. This soldier had followed Chairman Macklin for 20 years, from Green Dragon Mountain all the way to South Kazhou. He had killed countless people for the sake of the great cause of the committee. Although he didn't have epaulets, he was undoubtedly an absolute powerhouse on the battlefield. But today, when facing this small-eyed man, he did not expect that the military knife would have an electric current. He did not expect that the other party could have such terrifying strength to be able to pierce the bulletproof vest with the military knife. So he died. He died very thoroughly. Su Lu struggled to get up. He didn't look at the soldier at his feet, who was staring at him with wide eyes and the blood flowing out of his eyes. He just clutched his chest and dragged his heavily injured body into the office. On the way, he saw the secretary in the confidential room who was holding his head and trembling. He directly knocked him out. Walking into the luxurious bedroom and past the bathroom, Sulu narrowed his eyes and arrived at his destination today. This was a glass door that looked very weak. He lowered his head and greedily breathed in a few breaths of fresh air. Then, he pulled out the pistol in his hand, aimed at the glass door, and pulled the trigger repeatedly. Bang, 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 bang. 17 bullets rapidly shot out, leaving a circle mark on the glass door. However, the glass door did not shatter. After killing so many people and bleeding so much blood, he finally saw his target, that grizzled-haired and solemn-looking Senator Macklin. At this time, the senator was sitting on a chair in the safe house with a calm face. He looked at him outside the glass door, his eyes showing pity and ridicule. Chapter 299. Despite the distance in the universe and the obstacles of thousands of mountains and rivers, Sulu did not hesitate to kill his way over. In the end, at the last moment, he was blocked by a glass door that looked very thin and brittle. That last step. Heaven and earth could not block his eyes. The glass door in front of him was extremely clear, but it cast a layer of haze over his heart. The continuous shots left clear marks on the smooth glass door, but the glass door did not show any signs of shattering. He did not know what material it was made of, but it was so sturdy. Sulu and Macklin looked at each other calmly through the glass. This was the first time they had met in person, but the moment they saw each other, they were going to fight to the death. This was a safe house. In the official residences of the real political leaders of the Federation, they would often design such a place of last resort. However, most of the safe houses were mainly designed with high-strength alloys. Very few people would use transparent polymeric materials. Did this mean that the owner of this safe house had some kind of psychological abnormality? It was said that there was such a safe house in the White President's official residence in the Capital Special District. That safe house had an independent life support system and extremely strong defensive capabilities. It could directly resist the shots of battleships' main cannons outside the atmosphere, or nearby super-strong explosions. It could also ensure that the president, who was hiding in the safe house, could live alone and safely for 7 days. Senator Macklin's safe house inside the Foundation building should not be more powerful than that one. However, without powerful heavy firepower, an ordinary assassin would never be able to take a step forward. Sulu had just arrived in front of Councilman Macklin after crossing mountains, rivers, and corpses. Was she going to be stopped by this layer of glass? This was the first time he saw Macklin in reality, but at this time, he did not look at the old statesman's demeanor or the last scene behind the glass. He just glanced at him and walked to the side of the glass door, stabbing the bayonet into the wallpaper. With a click, Sulu pried open the safe house's assembly control system. His blood-stained hands started to move, quickly separating the data cable from the power cable in the box and then connecting them. He was so focused that he did not hear the gunshots that were getting louder and louder from behind the building. Macklin, who was behind the glass door, narrowed his eyes slowly. He did not know the killer outside, but he was very familiar with the young man's face. He was the nobody named Sulu. Although you are a genius engineer, don't expect to be able to open the safe house from the outside. His voice came out from the communication system in the corner of the safe house. His voice was slightly distorted. Okay. Sulu did not pay attention to what he was saying and continued to focus on his work. He had obtained enough information from Green Dragon Mountain in advance to enter the Golden Foundation building single-handedly. Naturally, he would not forget this safe house. Although the speed of his advance was much slower than he had planned, allowing Macklin to successfully hide, Sulu did not feel any despair or resentment in his heart. He had already made sufficient preparations. I've always been very curious about who would come to kill me, but I really did not expect that it would be you alone." Behind the glass door, Senator Macklin gently stroked a pen in his hand and sighed. He did not know how many life-and-death struggles he had experienced in his life, whether it was the expedition against the Empire, the internal purge of the anti-government forces in Green Dragon Mountain, or the guerrilla warfare in the mountains later. If it were not for some kind of providence protecting him, he believed that he would have died long ago. Sulu, who was outside the glass door, did not pay attention to him. He was still busy with his own work. Macklin narrowed his eyes as he watched this scene. He actually felt some appreciation for this extremely calm guy. Of course, it was more of a faint uneasiness and anger. Today, S1 was holding a presidential inauguration ceremony. As a politician without any family background, Macklin had spent most of his life taking a circuitous path in order to be able to ascend to the position of vice president. Yes, vice president. Because the vice president was also the chairman of the Federation Management Committee, only the Federation Management Committee could truly get close to the mysterious Bureau of Proclamation. Macklin narrowed his eyes. At this moment, he thought of many things that had happened many years ago. If he had not gone to Bermuda, perhaps he would still be a hot-blooded and upright veteran in the eyes of the Federation people. However, destiny was destiny after all, and this was something that no one could change. He did not think that he had failed. He believed that in the history of the universe, no one had been more successful than himself. Although he had not been able to ascend to the highest political throne in the Federation, after operating in the Federation for so many years, he had already obtained what that person had asked for his help to obtain many years ago. Macklin narrowed his eyes and looked at Sulu, who was silently busying himself outside the door. He knew that the other party could not come in at all. As long as the backup forces inside the building or the Federation government's army rushed over, he would definitely be safe. However, he did not feel too much joy at surviving because in the original plan, he was supposed to take advantage of the inauguration ceremony in the capital to go to the faraway West Woods to visit the frontline soldiers and then quietly disappear into the universe. All of this had been forcefully delayed by the small-eyed man outside the glass door. Thinking of this, a self-deprecating smile appeared on Macklin's lip. No one in the entire universe could really see through him. If it was the Federation who had discovered his secret, if it was the Bureau of Proclamation who had discovered his secret, perhaps he could accept it a little more. However, it was obvious that Sulu, who was outside the glass door, did not know anything. The mission that he had used his whole life to complete was going to be ruined by the stubbornness and impulsiveness of a young man who did not know anything. Macklin could not help but touch his white hair and sigh in his heart. Sulu, who was outside the door, seemed to have heard the sigh in his heart. He lowered his head and carried on with his work seriously. Suddenly, he opened his mouth and said, "There's something I've been wanting to ask you face to face." It was strange to say that the heroic and cold assassin, the scheming target, had a temporary peace because of the glass door. They could even have a conversation that was extremely difficult to imagine. Macklin looked at him with a smile. "Please ask." Sulu lowered his head and quickly answered. Without looking up, he asked, "You were the one behind the incident in Linhai and the concert, right?" Although countless evidence had already proven that Macklin was the cold-blooded and terrifying mastermind behind the scenes, Sulu still wanted to ask this person face to face. Yes. Macklin climbed up from the bottom. He was able to obtain the support of countless people in the Federation. He was able to walk the line between the government and the anti-government army. He was also able to obtain the help of countless higher-ups in the Federation. To be able to make someone like Zhang Xiaoming follow him to death, he must have a very outstanding side and his unique personality. Therefore, when Sulu asked this question, Macklin smiled and gave an affirmative answer without thinking. Sulu still lowered his head and asked, "Can you face your conscience?" Macklin, who was behind the glass door, after hearing this seemingly naive and childish sentence, became strangely silent. He thought of the factory and the companions he grew up in since he was a child. He thought of the comrades who bathed in blood with him. But then he thought of the indescribable loneliness and the lofty sense of mission in his heart all these years. He was surrounded by others. What an unbearable life this was. Conscience is when we realize the existence of the moral court in our hearts. Look at the planet under your feet. It's still rotating. Macklin's slightly inflected voice came from beside the glass door. What I do is in accordance with the moral court in my heart. Hearing this sentence, Sulu did not say anything. He silently completed the connection of the safe house's assembly system. He raised his wrist and said softly to his watch, "Can you hear me?" Cracking the safe house's password required a powerful computing platform. In the plan, this task should have belonged to the high-level workbench at the mountaintop, and the person operating the workbench should have been Magnolia. Secretary Bai's soft but reassuring voice did not come through the earpiece. Suli's heart gradually turned cold. During the later part of the assault, Magnolia at the mountaintop disappeared. He did not think that Secretary Bai had betrayed him at the most critical moment, because Magnolia had an excellent opportunity to do so. Sulu was only worried that something might have happened to Magnolia at the mountaintop. Without the workbench to remotely decode the code, how could he open the safe house? Sulu should have confirmed this before the connection. Otherwise, it would have been a waste of time. But strangely, he did not seem to have such knowledge. Instead, he directly reconnected to the assembly system. With a soft beep, the 8 hidden buttons on the glass door outside the safe house were all locked. It was harder to break than before. He dragged his injured leg back to the glass door, raised the pistol, and narrowed his eyes to aim at the circle left by the bullet on the glass door. He pulled the trigger again. His heart was a little heavy and anxious. He was very confident in the glass door in front of him. However, at this time, the reinforcements had yet to arrive. The people from the 2nd Military Region had yet to arrive, and the helicopters had yet to arrive. The spaceship in the distant spaceport was still waiting for him. Would he be able to board the spaceship that did not require a ticket today? His heart was also a little heavy and anxious. Who knew how many light years away, in the star sector outside the Federation, there was a person whose heart was heavier and more anxious than Sulu and Macklin, who were on the brink of death. Lin Banshan, the top figure in the 2nd generation of the 7 major families in the Federation, the most famous rebel, and the one who could break the marriage alliance between the 2 families, was looking out of the glass window with a melancholy face. The glass window reflected his thin and cold face, which overlapped with the street view of the first administrative planet of Bermuda outside the window. It was somewhat unpredictable. The living environment of the Bermuda star sector was much more dangerous than that of the Federation. Even though it was the number 1 administrative planet, the 4 seasons were much harsher. For example, it was late winter outside the window, and the temperature had dropped to -30 degrees Celsius. The smugglers who should have been wandering on the streets had no choice but to return to their lairs or spaceships. Lin Banshan should have been in South Kazhou at this time, eating meat and drinking with his most trusted right-hand man, Zhang Xiaohua, while watching the presidential inauguration ceremony with a smile. But as early as 10 days ago, he quietly left the Federation and came to Bermuda alone. He, who was evaluated by Lady Tai as a hero in troubled times, left his roots and subordinates so easily, and took the risk to secretly come here. Naturally, he had something important to do. Many years ago, he also came to the dangerous Bermuda alone like this and built his own empire in this chaotic land. In these 10 days, he was going to rely on the foundation he built back then to investigate the suspicious case from decades ago. Even Lin Banshan couldn't help but feel heavy and anxious when he thought of the suspicious case. He stood in front of the window, waiting for the results of the interrogation. His shoulders felt like they were cut by a knife, and he felt a little overwhelmed. He turned back and walked to his desk. The light screen that had not been turned off for a day and a night was constantly playing a video on loop. The video was obviously very old, and the picture quality was quite blurred. Bermuda was not like the Federation, which had the support of the glory of the Charter. It did not have the support of the huge database of the central computer. It had to be said that Lin Banshan was extraordinary to find this video from many years ago. Lin Banshan sat in a chair, squinting at the video, motionless. In the video, the respected old senator was just a young man who had just retired from the army. The two people who were talking to him, one was a young fat man, and the other had a delicate face, but gave a strange feeling, as if he was wearing a mask. A file appeared on the light screen. Lin Banshan pinched his tired eyebrows and opened the file. The file was the result of the analysis by a professional lip analysis expert. Lin Banshan looked at the dialogue in the file, and his eyes gradually narrowed. An extremely cold chill appeared in his eyes. Night Scorpion, Gary Corridor. Lin Banshan murmured and repeated the two nouns, confirming something. He suddenly got up, pushed open the bookcase behind him, walked into the secret room, and said coldly to the confidential secretary, "Connect to the Bureau of Proclamation." The confidential secretary nodded. While operating, he replied, "The synchronization will take 7 minutes. Don't worry about synchronization." Lin Banshan coldly scolded, "Now?" Whether it was in the Federation's underground society, or traveling the universe, this most famous prodigal son of the Federation was always so calm when dealing with his subordinates and partners. Especially the people in this room, they had followed him for many years, but it was the first time they saw him so cautious. No one dared to say anything and quickly started their work, connecting to the distant Federation Bureau of Proclamation. The door in the other corner of the secret room was pushed open, and a middle-aged man in black walked out, exuding a cold aura. The middle-aged man's face was pale, and he was wiping the blood on his hands with a handkerchief. Before the door closed automatically, a person could be vaguely seen hiding in the chair behind the door. That person was extremely fat, and his hair was white. Looking at his old face, it seemed to be similar to the fat man in the video that Lin Banshan had been paying attention to. However, at this time, this old fat man was covered in blood, and his hands hanging weakly by the chair looked like skinned willow branches. No one knew how many cruel punishments he had suffered. He's confessed. The middle-aged man in black walked to Lin Banshan's side, and an unhealthy blush appeared on his pale face. His voice trembled slightly as he spoke excitedly. This black-clothed middle-aged man had come to Lin Banshan's side with Zhang Xiaohua. Lin Banshan trusted this partner very much. He knew that his partner's subordinates loved to cruelly extort confessions, but the result of today's extortion made even him feel excited and nervous. Lin Banshan thought of the answer that was about to be revealed, and his eyes narrowed slightly. The middle-aged man in black lowered his voice and said faintly, "The other person in the video was the Empire's Prince Norton." Even though he was mentally prepared, even though Lin Banshan was probably the first powerful figure in the Federation to suspect Macklin, when he heard this name and confirmed the answer to the riddle he had been painstakingly searching for a long time, his mountain-like body couldn't help but tremble slightly. Prince Norton, the current Emperor of the Empire. The information connection with the Bureau of Proclamation had been completed, and all the staff in the secret room had left, including the middle-aged man in black. Lin Banshan stood in front of the light screen and looked at the motionless portrait on the screen. He said in a deep voice, "The information is not synchronized, you just need to listen." In the 27th year of the 37th constitutional calendar, Macklin's father died. He received a grant and entered the Faculty of History and Economics of the Capital University. Lin Banshan looked down at the information in his hand and said, "The central computer found the grant to Bermuda, So you asked me to come and help you. I don't have evidence to accuse Macklin of anything now, but I can confirm that in the spring of the 27th year of the constitutional calendar, Macklin went to Bermuda, and under the arrangement of the pirate leader, he met a person. That person could be the Empire's Prince Norton, which is the current emperor of the Empire. I don't know why an emperor would take the risk to come to Bermuda, and you should know that Macklin was just a small figure back then. But today, Macklin is a big figure. Lin Banshan lowered his head and said, "He has operated in the Federation and the anti-government army for so many years, I'm worried that the coordinates of the two space passages in the Night Scorpion Nebula and Gary Corridor, the things we want to protect, should still be in his hands. Within the Federation, he can't send these things away. All these years, he hasn't left the Federation even once." Lin Banshan raised his head and looked at the motionless light screen. He said firmly, full of murderous intent, "My suggestion is that we don't need evidence. Find Macklin and kill him. I'll remind you one last time, this matter has nothing to do with politics, it only has to do with the Federation," he said with a sullen face, then turned off the light screen and walked out of the office without looking back. "Get ready, we'll return to the Federation immediately," Lin Banshan said gloomily. As the top talent of the 7 major families in the Federation, he knew better than anyone the pedantic and dangerous politics of the Federation. He was very worried that Macklin, an enemy with full political wisdom, would use the historical inertia of the upper echelons of the Federation to find a gap that could be exploited. Chapter 300. In the outskirts of the capital, in the Bureau of Proclamation. Cui Zhedong was 42 years old this year. He was the assistant director of the Bureau of Proclamation of the Federation. He had been in this most mysterious and special organization of the Federation for 20 years. His hair was already white, and his eyebrows were gradually wrinkled. The relaxed working environment should not have caused him to age so quickly, but the old director with the surname C always had a habit of throwing everything to him. The heavy pressure and tedious affairs were almost crushing him to the point of suffocation. He sat in front of his desk and watched the extremely cold voice of that guy on the holographic screen. He could not help but sigh softly. He felt that there were a few more wrinkles on his forehead, and a few more strands of white hair. Although he had experienced countless major events in the Bureau of Proclamation over the years, major events that the citizens of the Federation might never know, when he heard this report today, he still could not help but feel a little cold in his heart. The universe was so big, but the Federation and the Empire just had to bump into each other. It was probably the will of the Creator to let the two carbon-based life societies that were similar to each other violently begin to collide with each other before they were mentally prepared. Philosophers and anthropologists had always been trying to find the biological blood relationship between the humans of the Federation and the humans of the Empire. They had even pointed their suspicious gazes at the barbaric era countless years ago. Most scholars had already come to a consensus, but they had not found evidence for the time being. They believed that the human society that suddenly encountered the Federation nearly 100 years ago should be a branch of the Federation back then. Otherwise, there was no way to explain the sudden appearance of an empire in the universe. The life forms in this empire were not like the aliens in the movies who had 8 legs, a natural insect shell, and could constantly spit out acid. Instead, they were like the people in the Federation. They could walk, think, fall in love, be angry, and hate. Director Cui Zhedong's assistant stared blankly at the file in his hand. He looked at the picture of Senator Macklin on the file, and felt as if his body had fallen into an ice pit at the North Pole. It was incomparably cold. The two sides had been at war for decades and had long formed an irreconcilable blood feud that could not be resolved. However, who would have thought that as early as a few decades ago, the Empire had already created such an unbelievable situation? Cui Zhedong stood up and walked to the window. Looking at the busy staff in the lobby downstairs, he couldn't help but frown. The people from the West Woods military district who went to Bermuda had not returned with any news yet. The records of the human trafficking from more than 60 years ago might have been destroyed long ago, and the biological samples that the Special Forces of the 2nd Military District took the risk of digging up graves in Green Dragon Mountain to retrieve were still on their way. In S2, the Bureau of Proclamation had sent out a special team. They had already made a preliminary comparison of the biological samples from both parties. They could basically confirm the Bureau of Proclamation's suspicion of the senator. But the problem was that this was a serious matter. Even with the Bureau of Proclamation's superior status in the Federation, if they could not obtain ironclad evidence, it would be difficult to convince the government to do anything. The hall was in a state of panic. In order to deal with one of the most inconceivable sequence events in the history of the Federation, the Bureau of Proclamation established a special task force for the first time. The reason why the old director with the surname Yun wanted to establish this special task force without the government's knowledge was because the target they were investigating, whether it was within the government or lower-level organizations, had an unimaginable number of partners and fanatical supporters. In order to keep it a secret, the Bureau of Proclamation's secret investigation was even hidden from the President's official residence and the Federation Management Committee. It was also because of the need for secrecy that the Bureau of Proclamation, which was usually only responsible for collecting information and never carried out specific tasks, showed a rare lack of fluster this time without the full support of the Federation Investigation Bureau. The office door was pushed open, and a member of the Special Task Force hurriedly walked in. He frantically flipped through the files in his hands and said, "The target has left S2 today and is heading to the front line of the West Woods to visit the army." "Going to the West Woods? I'm afraid he'll have to escape on the way." A chill rose in Cui Judong's heart. He waved his hand to signal for the staff member to leave. Then he picked up the phone in his hand and dialed a number. In front of the Parliament Hill in the capital's Special Administrative Region, President Pabre's 10-minute speech had not been long since the inauguration ceremony of the President of the Federation began. The guests and ordinary people on the stone steps carefully listened to every word with excitement and calmness. No one noticed that a strange atmosphere had already enveloped the viewing platform. The big shots in the upper echelons of the Federation seemed to be disturbed by a certain piece of news. Although they immediately calmed down, the deep eyes of those old faces flashed with a different light. The first big shot to know that the S2 Peace Foundation building was attacked was the director of the Federation Investigation Bureau. Within the Federation, this organization collected information the fastest. Just 2 minutes after the alarm sounded inside the Foundation building, the director of the Federation Investigation Bureau, who was standing in the second row of the viewing platform, heard the shocking news. At this time, he could not analyze who dared to do such a sensational and terrifying thing on the day of the inauguration ceremony. The director held the phone and occasionally looked up at President Pabre, who was giving a speech on the stage. He frowned slightly and forcibly suppressed the anger in his heart. In a low voice, he gave orders to his subordinate. Then, he quietly walked behind the National Security Advisor and whispered a few words. At this time, the National Security Advisor was looking at the president on the stone steps with a smile on his face. He hoped that President Pabre could see his sincere feelings. Although he was President Sieg's teacher, he still hoped to play a role in the new government. Suddenly, he heard a voice behind him. His face immediately became gloomy. He turned around and said a few words in a low voice. The actions of these two big shots immediately fell into the eyes of many people. The guests on the viewing platform could not help but speculate in their hearts. What had happened that made these two big shots want to talk about it, regardless of the fact that President Pabre was giving the most important speech? Then, the director of the Special Task Force, who had been silently standing behind the president on the stone steps, suddenly pressed the metal particles in his ear. His expression changed slightly. Then, he quietly took 2 steps back and whispered a few words. The guests on the viewing platform were undoubtedly the smartest and the most observant group of people in the Federation. When the director of the Special Task Force's strange look fell into their eyes and combined it with the scene they had noticed earlier, they were sure that something big must have happened. In an inconspicuous position in the second-to-last row of the viewing platform, Lady Tai, who was wearing a black windbreaker, slowly put down the phone in her hand. A trace of anger flashed in her usually calm eyes, which immediately turned cold. Then, Liyuan Palace and the heads of the 7 families of the Federation, who were quietly standing in the crowd, all learned of the violent assassination that was happening on S2 through their respective intelligence channels. The faces of all those who knew the inside story changed slightly. They might not know who the assassin was, and they did not care about the life or death of Senator Macklin. But they were concerned about the current situation in the Federation, which they had single-handedly controlled and created. But at this time, there were some disobedient, insignificant people who tried to destroy everything they had agreed on. So, they were shocked and angry. On the stone steps, President Pabre's speech was still going on, but the strange atmosphere on the viewing platform was getting thicker and thicker. On the most important day of the Federation, because of an assassination that happened in the distance, it became a little strange. The National Security Advisor quietly walked up the stone steps and said a few words behind the Vice President-elect, then pointed at the back of President Pabre. The Vice President-elect anxiously shook his head. More people looked at the eye-catching position in the first row of the viewing platform. The incident happened suddenly, and they wanted to know how the old director of the Bureau of Proclamation of the Federation would react. Behind the oath-taking platform, President Pabre also noticed the strange expressions of his subordinates and guests. He narrowed his eyes and calmly continued his policy speech, but the corner of his eyes swept over the director of the Bureau of Proclamation. In the eyes of the crowd, the white-haired director looked down, as if he didn't know anything. In fact, he was very clear about the reason for the strange situation at the presidential inauguration ceremony. In fact, he was the first person in the capital city to know about the S2 assassination. At this moment, the phone in his pocket vibrated. He leaned on his walking stick and left the viewing platform in a senile manner. Accompanied by his subordinates, he walked toward the back of the platform. He did not seem to care about the gazes that fell on him at all. It was as though this was not a presidential inauguration ceremony, and President Pable was not giving a speech. The old director held the phone and listened silently for a while, then slowly said, "How long has Su Lu been in there?" 14 minutes, 27 seconds. On the other end of the phone, the assistant director gave an extremely accurate answer. "Well, it seems that we can't count on him anymore." The old director heard the answer, slightly lowered his eyes and said, "You think he will escape? He was scheduled to leave S2 today, but the problem is that we don't know where the spaceship he prepared is." On the other end of the phone, Chui Judong said in a low voice, "And his identity is special. The Bureau doesn't have any evidence yet, so it's not convenient for us to directly issue orders." The old director was silent for a long time, then said, "The Bureau of Proclamation's words are the evidence." On the other end of the phone, Chui Judong didn't say anything, and just listened quietly. "Comb through all the aircraft that left S2 today. If Medellin really wants to leave," the old director's voice paused for a moment, "just shoot him down." After the phone call ended, the old director looked back at the Parliament Hill in the cold winter. His eyes slowly fell on the lady on the viewing platform, and then he frowned and looked at the so-called big shots on the platform. These big shots who liked to play politics only knew that Medellin was assassinated, but they didn't know what Medellin meant to the Federation. A hint of mockery flashed in the old director's eyes. To him, as long as the Bureau of Proclamation started paying attention, no one in the Federation could avoid the glory of the Constitution, and that was the same for Senator Medellin, who was well aware of the political shortcomings of the Federation. All the military officials and important figures were gathered in the capital of S1, and Medellin took advantage of the presidential inauguration ceremony to leave. He was really a smart guy to the bone. Without the military's orders, who dared to stop Medellin from leaving? If that person really went into the depths of the vast universe, who could stop Medellin's return? Director C sighed softly, shook his head, and walked toward the Federal Fleet Commander, 3-star General Hong Yuliang. If the Bureau of Proclamation wanted to forcibly seize the temporary command authority of the fleet and shoot down Medellin's spaceship, they would at least have to give this strong woman a heads-up. Of course, Director C also knew very well that without a trial, the Bureau of Proclamation would have to pay a heavy price after killing a senator, a highly popular vice presidential candidate, and this price would most likely be his early retirement. However, he did not hesitate at all. The Emperor of the Empire had used that senator to toy with the Federation for so many years. As the director of the Bureau of Proclamation, he felt endless shame. If he could still let Medellin leave alive today, he might as well commit suicide. The Federation's second military region, Oak State Garrison Headquarters. The Golden Foundation building is calling for the third time, requesting emergency support. The enemy's attack speed is too fast, and they have a lot of firepower. A first lieutenant staff officer quickly ran behind the garrison commander and said with an unpleasant expression, "Commander, should we send a combat team over?" "Send my ass." The garrison commander did not pay attention to his subordinate's urgent request at all. His eyes were slightly red as he stared at the holographic map on the light screen. Looking at the clear heat traces on the map, looking at the flashing analysis numbers beside them, and then listening to the incredibly noisy voices of the staff officers on the other side, he vented all the emotions in his heart. He turned around and glared fiercely at the staff officer, saying, "The Green Dragon Mountain Army has been fully mobilized, and the entire military region is preparing for defense. You want me to send people to protect a *T senator at this time? Do you want me to go to military court?" The staff officer had nothing to say in response. In the early hours of this morning, the Green Dragon Mountain Anti-Government Army, which had not made any major military movements in the past few years, suddenly acted out of the norm and sent out 4 armies. Following the winding mountain paths in the mountains, they marched out of the mountains with an extremely threatening aura. Although the anti-government army's military movement had not yet broken through the actual control line of both sides, this kind of high-pressure situation made the federal army stationed around the 4 states feel an unprecedented pressure. Was the war really going to start? At this critical moment, the news of the Golden Foundation building being attacked was selectively forgotten by all the officers of the Federation's second military region. There were priorities, and with the war imminent, who would pay attention to this kind of thing? For the people of the second military region, it was better for an old wolf like Macklin, raised by the anti-government army, to die as soon as possible. The sudden attack of the anti-government army just happened to give them an excuse to feel at ease. It was because of the Green Dragon Mountain anti-government army's sudden combat readiness that the second military region, which was currently under a rain of bullets, had no intention of going to provide support even though it had been almost 20 minutes since the attack. What are these wolves in the mountains trying to do? The garrison commander stared coldly at the increasing number of red dots on the map. His heart was extremely cold. His immediate superior, the commander of the second military region, was attending the presidential inauguration ceremony in the capital today, but at this time, the Green Dragon Mountain anti-government army suddenly came out in full force. This situation was very suspicious. A huge explosion resounded in the mountains somewhere in the 4 states. This was not the front line of the battle between the government army and the anti-government army, but an abandoned factory that no one paid attention to. Reporting, mission successful. An anti-government army soldier wearing a camouflage uniform came to the forest and said to the middle-aged man wearing a straw hat in a deep voice. He smiled and patted the shoulder of the subordinate, then turned around to look at the place where the smoke rose. At this time, the comrades in the mountains should have already assumed a full-scale attack posture. Under such a high-pressure situation, the 2nd Military Region probably would not notice Macklin's movement. There was a temporary spaceship landing base in the abandoned factory. The escape route that Macklin had prepared should be here. He looked at the smoke and thought about how he met and fought with Macklin in this life. His heart became slightly cold. Although he was known as the most famous intelligence leader of the 37 constitutions, he was not an organization like the Federation's Bureau of Proclamation, so he did not know Macklin's true identity. He could not understand why Macklin was in such a hurry to leave. But since he had found this out, he made his own response. He and Macklin had fought for many years, and in the end, he did not know who won and who lost. But at least today, he cut off Macklin's support from the government and cut off Macklin's escape route. He had done everything he could. On the mountaintop southwest of the Peace Foundation building, a black workbench was lonely among the fallen leaves. There were a few corpses around it, and blood flowed slowly along the red leaves. The delicate man who was supposed to be guarding the workbench and providing technical support to Su Lu had disappeared without a trace. No one knew where he went. Inside the Peace Foundation building, many people had died, but some were still alive. The sound of bullets whistling through the air was intermittent, but it never stopped. The bullet marks and debris on the walls of the building fully proved how tragic the story had been from the beginning to the present. From time to time there was a dull sound. Some walls were penetrated, and some were blown to pieces. Amidst the blood and smoke, the hearts of the security personnel in the building were about to freeze. They didn't know who the second intruder was. Although this person might not be as unpredictable as the previous one, the absolute professional military accomplishment and the terrible weapon in his hand were like a black wall of death, blocking in front of them. Shi Qinghai, who was covered in blood, was holding a 37 brand cigarette and an ACW as he stood guard in front of the last tunnel in the East 3rd District. There were shiny bullet shells in front of and behind him, as well as a suitcase that he carried with him. The ACW trembled violently, spewing gunfire. His lips, which were holding the cigarette, were a little pale and trembling. He did not know how long he could hold on. He could only clearly feel that his blood was flowing out of the bullet holes. There were more dense bullet marks on the glass door, but the high-hardness material did not show any signs of breaking. In the middle of the circle of bullet marks that was hit by Su Lu, there were 3 neat lines. It was like a circle with the big word, people, written in the middle. Senator Macklin, whose hair was messy, squinted his eyes and stared at Su Lu outside the glass door through the slight bullet marks. Until now, he still firmly believed that as long as he stayed in the safe house for a while, the forces loyal to him would come to his aid. Even if all the people loyal to him died, the Federation government would not just stand by and watch him die. The commotion caused by his death would cause the 2nd Military Region to come to his rescue. As long as he left the Peace Foundation building, he would be able to rush to the unknown base, take the spaceship and leave S2. During the long journey to the West Woods, he would quietly disappear from Bermuda and return to his hometown. This would be a long journey home. What awaited him would be unprecedented achievements and a warm welcome from his family. However, this councilman didn't expect that there were many people who didn't know his true identity, but still used all their strength to try to keep him here or kill him for some ridiculous reason. For example, Shi Qinghai, who was fighting a bloody battle outside the room, or Su Lu, who was outside the glass door. Even if he could leave the building, he could not leave S2. Even if he left S2, What awaited him would be the Bureau of Proclamation's ruthless authority and the gunfire from the space fleet. Of course, if it was not for Sulu silently killing his way in today, perhaps before the Bureau of Proclamation could take action, Macklin would have already disappeared into the vast universe. The glass door did not shatter. Sulu lowered his head, but he was not disappointed. He took out a nutrition bar and ate it in big bites. Then, he sat down in the open space in front of the glass door and closed his eyes as if he was about to fall asleep. Macklin narrowed his eyes as he watched his strange actions. A strong sense of uneasiness grew in his heart, but he did not know where this uneasiness came from. Suddenly, he understood. His uneasiness came from his opponent's calmness. The young man outside the door had always maintained an absolute calmness, and this calmness was rather frightening. Macklin gently turned the pen in his hand, his pupils constricting slightly. There was something very important hidden in the pen. It contained the specific data of the 2 channels of the Night Scorpion Nebula and the Gary Corridor, as well as an extremely fine chip. If it were not for the election failure, perhaps he would not have thought of going home. However, he had already obtained enough valuable information. He should be able to go home with confidence. At this moment, Macklin's homesickness overwhelmed his fear of the current situation. Macklin had previously told Sulu through the door that although he was a genius engineer, he would not be able to open this security door. Sulu, who was sitting on the ground, opened his eyes at this moment. He looked at the senator behind the door and said, "I'm very good at physics." As soon as he finished speaking, his body began to tremble violently. His face was pale, but his eyes were exceptionally bright. He took a step forward, roared, and transferred all the energy in his body to his right arm in an instant. Then, he punched out like lightning. There was no need for tools. Humans were the best machines. Sulu only believed in his own fists. This punch happened to hit the point where the bullet marks converged, right in the middle of the character, human. With a muffled sound, it seemed as if the entire room began to tremble. Following the sound of paper tearing, a crack suddenly appeared on the extremely hard glass door that even bullets could not penetrate. Chapter 301. After following Professor Shin Yulin for many days, Su Li's theoretical physics was still his shortcoming. However, as an engineer with rich practical experience, his understanding and application of the non-elastic Hawk's law was not something an ordinary person could compare to. The connecting assembly system made the outer transparent material of the safe house sturdier. Bullets were used to forcibly draw a balanced line on the surface of the safe house. Finally, gravity was applied to the connecting part. Only then could one strike succeed. It was not difficult to have the theory and dare to put it into practice. The key was to have the means and ability to implement it and smash the evil safe house. The most important thing was Su Li's last punch. This punch was too fierce and too heavy. It was like a large steel ball hanging from a heavy dismantling machine, whizzing over. No matter how sturdy the design of the safe house was, it probably never occurred to them that a person's body could explode with the power of such a heavy machine. Therefore, in front of Su Li's fist, the transparent glass door cracked open. The white cracks spread out like a spider web. Then, it shattered into a messy postmodern image. In the end, it shattered into countless pieces of brittle glass and fell to the ground. It was like thousands of piles of snow piled up between the two of them. With such an inhuman strength, Su Li's right wrist snapped. His face was pale, but his squinted eyes were unusually bright. Without a trace of pain or hesitation, he walked into the door. His military boots stepped on the thousands of piles of broken glass and snow, making a rustling sound. Just as the glass door shattered, Senator Macklin's eyes, which were as calm as a lake, also shattered into pieces. The tranquil luster dimmed for a moment before dispersing in all directions. Because of the unimaginable abnormality in front of him and the approaching death, it disappeared from his old and tired black eyes. When a boy wooed the girl he liked by the Rose River, he would probably think of his peers in the movies. Those Casanova with big noses or small noses cheering for him. The young people who participated in the high school joint examination would definitely think of countless outstanding seniors or the best cheaters in the school to cheer for them. When the last soldier in the frontline tunnel in the West Woods held a cluster bomb and fearlessly charged at the Dynasty's tanks in front of him, he would definitely think of many heroes, such as Lipifu. Those who acted bravely for a just cause. Thinking back to those who acted bravely for a just cause in the past, those who did not care about their own safety, perhaps they did not have the time to think too much. People would habitually use a lot of mental things to boost their courage and confidence before doing something big. Sulu was also an ordinary person, and he was no exception. However, when he stepped on the glass and came to the front of Senator Macklin, he did not think of anything. Sulu did not expect Macklin to look like an old man with one foot in the grave. The look of despair on his face was like that of a person who deserved sympathy. He did not think about the consequences of killing Macklin. He did not think that it was a human life. Sulu did not think about the consequences of killing Macklin. He had watched this person for a whole year. He was a little tired and wanted to give up. However, the pictures of the dead children in Charter Square made him pick up the idea again. Perhaps it was because he thought for too long on the bench behind the snow, so he did not think about anything today. He did not need to think. Carrying his travel bag, he killed his way into the heavily surrounded Golden Foundation building and killed his way to the old man. Some people thought too much and did too little. Sulu would do it after he thought it through. He was just an ordinary person. At this time, he did not even know Macklin's true identity. What a small person like him did would have a great impact on the Federation. He raised the gun with his left hand and pulled the trigger. After entering the building, everything was going according to plan. However, there was a huge problem in the middle. But from the way Sulu dealt with the matter of the safe house, under the premise that he had enough information, he was a very calm person who could come up with a plan. So, at this time, he was sure that there was still one bullet left in his gun, the last bullet. However, the shot did not go off. The tough guns in Team 7's armory finally had a problem for the first time, but it happened at the most critical moment. Sulu mumbled something vaguely. Blood was flowing from the corner of his mouth. He threw the gun in his hand to the ground. At this moment, Macklin's slack eyes quickly closed and regained their luster. He had experienced too many moments of life and death in his life, but there was not a moment as shocking as when Sulu pulled the trigger between his eyebrows. However, when this moment disappeared, the experienced and tough Macklin was ready to seize this last chance. He did not try to take out the gun in his pocket to shoot. This was because what had happened before made him very clear that the small-eyed man in front of him had an unparalleled and terrifying strength in these aspects. Macklin reached out the pen that he had been holding in his hand and handed it to Sulu. He said in a hoarse voice, "I think you should need this very much." Until now, Macklin was still thinking about why this person called Sulu wanted to kill him. If it was to avenge the girl called Zhang Xiaoming, but Zhang Xiaoming was not dead. This experienced and ruthless Macklin would never have thought that Sulu wanted to kill him because of some old things that he thought were not worth mentioning in the eyes of the big shots in the Federation, such as Lin Hai and the concert. He had always thought that Sulu had invaded the Golden Foundation building and wanted to kill him for other reasons. There was some great interest involved. Perhaps he was representing the will of Lady Tai, or perhaps he had some conflict with those guys in Green Dragon Mountain. Therefore, Macklin handed over his pen and was ready to negotiate with him in a hoarse voice. Sulu looked at the pen in front of him and was slightly stunned. He thought to himself, should I say thank you? I want to kill him now, but he still wants to find a convenient person for me? He was so calm and indifferent in the face of death. Although this Macklin was an unforgivable person, it still made him feel a little emotional. No one, not even the history books of the Federation in the future, knew that this was actually just a misunderstanding. Su Li's face was expressionless. Perhaps this was the only way to calm his emotions. He took the pen and stabbed it in silence. The black, expensive ink pen had a hard alloy tip at the front end. It drew a dark ray of light in the air, like a knife that the orphans of Donglin would play with on the muddy ground. With a poof, it pierced into Macklin's neck. Then it was pulled out. Macklin did not react at all. It was not until the blood on his neck spurted onto the wall that he realized what had happened. He frowned and covered the wound on his neck that was spurting blood. He stared at Su Lu and wanted to say something, but no words came out. He took 2 steps back, tripped over a chair, and sat on the ground with a crash. Blood continued to flow out from the gaps between his pale and withered fingers. The old senator furrowed his brows in pain and breathed in the last few breaths of air. His eyes widened as he looked at Su Lu with a trace of disbelief. Finally, he twitched a few times and stopped breathing. During the process of Macklin's death, Su Lu stared at him silently. He stared at his face, his eyes, the fingers on his neck that were covering the wound, and the blood that was oozing out between his fingers. As the blood oozing out between his fingers became less and less, and thicker, he took a deep breath. At this time, he seemed to have some free time to think. Watching the person in front of him slowly die, Su Lu thought of the beautiful ticket-takers in the Linhai State Gymnasium. Those girls whispered behind him, discussing how such a student could sit in the most luxurious box. Some of those girls later became corpses. Su Lu had seen it with his own eyes when he was on the run with Tai Zhuan. He thought of the concert in Mountain 4 State. He thought of the children who died at the age of 6 or 7. He thought of the children's innocent and young faces when they died and slept. He thought of their families and the few people in Charter Square. Su Lu watched Macklin die. His left eye could see ghosts at this time. In the hologram in his left eye, the string of citizen numbers that had been floating above Macklin's head shattered and then disappeared like the previous door. When he saw this scene and confirmed Macklin's death, he lowered his head and gently breathed. Breathe, breathe the air without you. How fresh this air is. However, like a balloon that had been filled with air, he exhaled a mouthful of turbid air. The goal of meditating without sleep was achieved. Su Li's mind couldn't help but feel a little lost. In an instant, the injuries that were suppressed by his strong willpower all broke out. He had been hit by many bullets. Although the hard ceramic bulletproof vest had protected most of his vital parts, he had been bleeding all the way here. He was already extremely weak. His previously forgotten broken right wrist was also starting to feel waves of sharp pain. Su Lu moved his sore and stiff body with difficulty, leaned against the wall next to him, and slowly sat down. In the capital special district of Planet S1 far away, in front of the sea of people in front of the Parliament Hill, the people who participated in the presidential inauguration ceremony looked excitedly at the dark-faced president on the stone step. President Pabre's speech had come to an end. The overwhelming words, the sonorous and powerful words, and the promises that were not too complicated but were exceptionally powerful, were like countless bells that struck the hearts of the citizens who had placed endless hope in the new Federation government. The guests on the viewing platform had smiles on their faces as they respectfully and courteously watched President Prabal, who was waving his arms. However, what they were thinking was completely different from what they were thinking about during the solemn inauguration ceremony. The old director of the Bureau of Proclamation slowly closed the phone in his hand. Thinking of the news he had just heard, a smile appeared on his aged lips. The smile was full of endless relief. Macklin was dead. It's good that he's dead. I'll have to write Macklin's words in the future. From the beginning of the design, it was to have Su Lu use the pen to kill Macklin, so he had to arrange for the last bullet to go wrong. The reason for this was that he felt that perhaps Macklin would not do anything personally, but he could use orders to frame people and harm many people. From the bottom of his heart, he was not an official of the pen, so it was more appropriate for him to die with the pen. That paragraph also wanted to explain that many things could be negotiated. Many people would think so, but Su Lu had never thought about this problem. He was more direct. I originally thought that I would have to wait until 9 o'clock to write this chapter. Fortunately, I was in a good mood. Although my body is quite weak, I wrote it much earlier. At this time, I went to eat and then put on more clothes to keep warm. Speaking of which, it's only October, but the temperature is lower than I've ever experienced in my life. It's still the old saying from a long time ago. China is too big, and the difference between the North and the South is too big. The Federation is also very big. Chapter 302. The glory of the Charter, which was spread all over the Federation, was naturally aware of Macklin's death. The news quickly spread from the Bureau of Proclamation to the site of the inauguration ceremony. The old director with the surname Yun was the first to confirm the news, only a few minutes after Su Lu pulled out the tip of his pen. It was a crime to harbor a treasure, but at least he was holding something valuable. This news was not good news. The old director softly told the person he needed to tell, and then the news began to spread among the high-ranking government officials on the viewing platform and the stone steps. Although the range of the news was limited to a very small number of people, their shocked expressions still gave many people some hints. At this time, the director of the Bureau of Proclamation was basically able to confirm the true identity of Macklin, so when he heard the news, his old heart was filled with endless relief. He stood on the viewing platform with a smile and maintained his silence. The other high-ranking government officials, however, did not know this at this time, so their expressions were the opposite of his, extremely ugly. With warm applause, whistles, and music in front of Parliament Hill, President Pabre ended his speech. He kindly and extremely politely thanked the old Chief Justice, Mr. Hieng, and then waved to the people below the stone step. He held his wife's hand, and accompanied by his aides and office officials, they walked to the resting area. On the way, Vice President Byron and the director of the Federation Investigation Bureau quickly whispered a few words in his ear. President Pabre's expression suddenly became serious, his dark face hiding a trace of deep anger. He pondered for a moment and then quickened his pace. The inauguration ceremony was still going on, and there should be several performances to set the atmosphere. The top cultural figures from the various regions of the Federation would work hard to show their best side, so the sea of people did not disperse, but waited excitedly. They did not know that the Federation had a big event today, and no one noticed the president's quick pace in the shadow of the winter tree. The guests on the viewing platform gradually dispersed. The high-ranking officials and generals of the government and military were all heading towards the president's residence not far away to participate in the first Federation government meeting. At this time, they roughly knew what had happened in the 4 states around S2, and their expressions couldn't help but be somewhat worried. The president of the 3 Forest Federation Bank, old Mr. Li Yuan-gong, walked down with the help of his son. The short man adjusted the black round hat on his head, squinted his eyes, and looked back at Lady Tai. He found that the lady had already left. He couldn't help but sigh softly. Macklin is dead. We don't know who did it yet, but there should be news soon. Get ready. In the cold weather, the old man from Liyuan Palace coughed twice. The wrinkles on his face were as deep as knives. He looked at his successor and said, "I think the president must be very angry. On the first day he came to power, he received such bad news." Li Xiuzhu, wearing a short gray windbreaker and a bow tie, looked very energetic. Although he had already guessed before, he had never thought that he would hear the news of Macklin's death today. His beautiful eyebrows instantly furrowed. He lowered his voice and said in a hurried tone, Father, what should we do? The Federation government will naturally do what they should do. Liyuan Palace took off his thick gloves and walked out along the special passage for the distinguished guests. What we need to do is to fully cooperate. Fully cooperate? Cooperate with what? Suppress the commotion that may soon arise because of Macklin's death? Li Xiuju's furrowed brows still couldn't loosen. Thinking of the politician who had just died, the old man from Liyuan Palace couldn't help but sigh softly. White mist scattered around his dry lips. The Federation can't be in chaos. I think both President Pabre and his wife will realize this. The old man said, since he's already dead, we have to accept this reality and do a good job of cooperating. This sentence was said very indifferently. The death of Macklin, who had been secretly cooperating with the Li family for a long time, was like a stranger in this old man's words. Last time, he was just caught and sent to the Justice Department, and this is already happening. I'm very worried, Li Xiuju said worriedly. Behind him, for some reason, there was a burst of enthusiastic cheers in the square. The old man from Liyuan Palace walked forward with a smile and said slowly in an old voice, I never look down on any ordinary people, but I also never overestimate their loyalty to their beliefs. Li Xiuju's heart trembled slightly. He vaguely understood something. Last time, Macklin's fanatical supporters had caused such a big commotion in the Federation. It seemed that his family was behind it. However, at that time, the Li family needed Macklin's ability to incite people to ensure that the Federation's investigation wouldn't go too deep and involve them. Now that Macklin was dead, the Li family naturally didn't have to worry about anything. They naturally had to stand firmly on the side of the government, or rather on the side of the people. A few black cars without obvious markings were walking on the side road. The winter trees had no leaves, and the sun was clear and cold. Because of the traffic control of the presidential inauguration, these few cars were particularly eye-catching. Lady Tai sat in the back and looked at the street through the window. For the upper class of the Federation, this appearance on the viewing platform today was a rare opportunity to get close to her. Although she deliberately stood in the most inconspicuous corner, after the ceremony was over, who knew how many high officials and nobles tried to say a few words to her. However, this lady didn't have any desire to talk today. She looked at the withered trees with a heavy heart. Different from the wise old man from the Li family, she already knew who the mastermind behind the assassination at the S2 Foundation building was. The interior of the car was as warm as spring. The madam quietly looked at the winter scenery, but she suddenly thought of the editor and reporter from the Capital Daily News. She thought of the inspector who was still locked up in the FBI but refused to back down. She thought of the crazy and dangerous people in Green Dragon Mountain. She thought of the man from many years ago. Naturally, she also thought of Su Lo. She felt a little cold. The young man she wanted to control was indeed an extremely dangerous person, just like his teacher. Since that was the case, then he couldn't be left alive. Medellin is dead. Lady Tai retracted her gaze from the window and calmly said, His Excellency the President may have some problems. Let the TV station and the network headquarters cooperate with the government. Secretary Shunli, who was sitting in the front passenger seat, slightly stiffened, then immediately reacted and calmly replied. At this moment, a bell rang in the capital's special district. The clear and distant sound of the bell passed through a few blocks and was then filtered by the thick glass of the black car, becoming somewhat dull and deep. President Pabre's motorcade had already arrived at the president's official residence. The former president, Mr. Sieg, was waiting for them on the lawn. The highest authority of the Federation had begun to be handed over. According to the historical custom of the Federation, the bell next to Charter Square began to ring. Lady Tai listened to the bell with a calm expression, but in her heart she was thinking, who is this bell ringing for? Su Lu leaned against the wall, his face pale. His fractured right wrist hung over his knee, and the ground around him was a mess. Today, he had used all of his energy and squeezed out every drop of strength in his body. With the help of that great existence, he was so lucky, or perhaps crazy, to achieve his goal. The moment he fell, all of his injuries and exhaustion exploded, causing him to sit on the ground. He was so weak that he couldn't even lift a finger. The gunshot wounds on his body were very serious, but what really drained him was the final blow. A year ago in the underground parking lot of Linhai Stadium, he had valiantly kicked a military mecha, causing him to vomit blood and fall to the ground from the recoil. Today, he was much stronger than he was then, so he could still hold on, but he couldn't continue with the rest of the plan. Listening to the increasingly sparse gunshots outside the room and the scattered footsteps that gradually approached the door, Sulu lowered his head, speechless. The door was knocked open, and a person covered in blood rushed in. The first thing this person did after coming in was not to shoot at Sulu, but to push all of the furniture around the door behind the door, including 2 extremely heavy safes. Sulu raised his head, and with just one glance, his eyes lit up. When he knew that there was someone supporting him outside, he had been guessing who that person was. Now, he found that it was indeed him. Shi Qinghai, whose face was covered in blood, turned around and saw Macklin's body on the ground. He was slightly stunned. At this moment, his feet seemed to be filled with lead, showing his true condition. He laughed bitterly, walked to the wall with difficulty, and slid down weakly against the wall to sit beside Sulu. Sulu spat out a mouthful of blood, but it was spat on his clothes. He turned his head with difficulty, looked at this guy, and said in a hoarse voice, "I was hoping that you could get me out." Police sirens sounded around the Golden Foundation building. The police had rushed over. The Federation Investigation Bureau and more powerful departments had finally arrived. Even if all the security personnel inside the Golden Foundation building were killed by the 2 of them, it would be harder than climbing to the sky to escape now. "I was hoping that you could get me out." Shi Qinghai lowered his head and scolded with a smile. His chest was heaving up and down. He had already thrown the ACW outside because he had run out of bullets. After blocking for Sulu in the building for so long, his body was already full of scars. It had to be said that this fierce person, who was trained by the 1st Military Academy and the Green Dragon Mountain Anti-Government Federation, was extremely capable and lucky to be able to survive until now. Su Li's plan did have a final escape plan, but at this time, the 2 people sitting against the wall had already used up all their energy in the previous brilliant battle. They didn't leave any power or escape route for themselves, so they didn't have the ability to carry out the final plan. Of course, if they hadn't put in so much effort and fought so valiantly before, they wouldn't have been able to do it in front of such a tight defense. Sulu looked down at the bracelet on his wrist, laughed bitterly, and coughed violently, coughing up 2 puddles of blood. The 2 people looked up at each other, shook their heads at the same time, and smiled in relief. At this time, there were countless fully armed combatants inside and outside the building. Not far away, the roar of armed helicopters could be faintly heard. The police headquarters and the investigators of the Federation Investigation Bureau had already confirmed the life and death of Councilman Macklin from the Bureau of Proclamation, so they didn't choose to attack immediately. Instead, they waited outside the building, trying to find a way to be as safe as possible. Of course you have to use a sniper for an assassination. You brat, you only knew how to kill your way in, and now I'm going to die with you. Tell me, how are you going to compensate me? Shi Qinghai said as he coughed. His handsome face was full of blood, and there was a terrible wound on his left cheek, looking extremely hideous. Sulu glanced at him and smiled with difficulty. At this time, he was probably sure that there was a problem with Magnolia. He was killed by that guy and Mr. Schur was killed by him. Since I've killed you, then I'll compensate you with a son. Sulu lowered his head and wiped the blood on his lips. He smiled and said, You probably don't know, but Zhou gave birth to a son for you. His name is Zhou Liuhua, and he has no physical defect." As soon as he said this, Shi Qinghai suddenly fell into silence. He narrowed his eyes and looked at Su Lu for a long time before he confirmed that this guy was not lying to comfort him before he died. His heart suddenly beat faster, and there was a touch of gentleness and shyness in his excitement. "Really? Not really." Shi Qinghai was silent for a long time and then said, "Unfortunately, I didn't know." Suddenly, he smiled and laughed. "But this shows that I'm really fierce. I can actually kill them with one shot." Su Lu wanted to laugh, but he couldn't. He kept coughing. Shi Qinghai narrowed his eyes and thought for a while. Then he took out a pack of 37 brand cigarettes with trembling hands and lit them up with trembling hands. He didn't have the calm and steady feeling he had when he was killing people in all directions. He took 2 deep breaths and then passed one over with trembling hands. He found that Su Lu didn't take it. Then he noticed that Su Li's right wrist was twisted, and there were several wounds on his left arm that were bleeding. Shi Qinghai shook his head and put a cigarette between Su Li's bloody lip. "You really shouldn't have come," he said. Su Lu held the cigarette in his mouth and said vaguely, "I wanted to come, so I came." The ashes of the cigarette fell and mixed with the blood on his chest. Shi Qinghai narrowed his eyes and looked around the office. He noticed that there was a painting hanging on the wall. It was a freehand painting of a splash ink lotus, and the style was dripping and fierce. He couldn't help but be puzzled. He murmured, "That guy Macklin, where did he get so much righteousness from?" Su Lu raised his head with difficulty, and squinted his eyes to take a look. He thought about what Macklin had said behind the door about conscience, and was puzzled by it. Only then did he remember that the pen he had used to kill Macklin was still tightly held in his left hand. He loosened his fingers and let the blood-stained pen slide to the ground. He said, "I used this pen to kill him. I thought that if you could escape, I would leave it as a souvenir for you. Don't think of anything good." Shi Qinghai reached out and grabbed the pen with difficulty. He looked at it curiously and suddenly said, "I don't know if the government will allow me to leave this pen to my son as an inheritance." "Don't think of anything good," Su Lu answered weakly with his head down and the cigarette in his mouth. "Zhou Yu didn't find another man, did she?" "No, I kept an eye on her for you. Why do I feel a little guilty? I found another woman. But I didn't know, so it's not wrong, right? Hey, when did you become so close to her? I don't think I know her that well." Oh, this is another long story. The inside and outside of the foundation building was heavily guarded. Blood and bullet marks filled the building. Countless fully armed combatants were holding guns and occupying all the passages. They surrounded the room. Maybe in the next moment they would rush in and kill the 2 powerful terrorists. However, the 2 people who made them feel like they were facing a great enemy were no longer able to fight. They were sitting next to Macklin's body, smoking a 37 brand cigarette, and talking about some very boring things. I just heard the sound of a bell. Shi Qinghai took the half-burned cigarette from his mouth and said lightly. The filter of the cigarette was full of blood. "What time is it?" Su Lu lowered his head and said purely subconsciously. Shi Qinghai looked at him helplessly and said, I heard the death knell for us." As soon as he finished speaking, gunshots rang out. The glass window on the right side of the senator's office was instantly shattered into pieces. Then, a smoke bomb was shot in. In the chaos, a few Special Forces members dressed in black slipped down from the sky and pounced in like a few fierce tigers. There were also several big holes in the wall because of the explosion. Countless fully armed combatants flooded in. "Very unprofessional." Shi Qinghai murmured a few times and confirmed that smoking cigarettes was indeed not as good as smoking cigarette. Although Su Li's left eye could still see through the smoke and see the movements of the intruders, he couldn't do anything and was too lazy to do anything. Whether it was him or Shi Qinghai, they had no bullets and no strength. Even the blood in their bodies was about to run out. "Don't move! Hands up!" With a few loud shouts, the smoke gradually dispersed. Countless black gun barrels were pointed at the two people sitting against the wall at close range. The head of the Special Task Force walked in with a heavy expression, but the phone in his hand was pressed tightly to his ear. An extremely important order had just come from the distant capital. As soon as he put down the phone, he saw the scene in the room and couldn't help but stiffen slightly. Senator Macklin's body was on the side. This was the news that had been confirmed earlier. What surprised him was the behavior of the two terrorists against the wall at this time. Facing the countless gun barrels, Shi Qinghai, who was already exhausted, quickly raised his hands in the air. He was tearing up because of the smoke, and his eyes were red as he said seriously, "I surrender." At this time, he was holding a cigarette that was almost burnt out in his right hand and a bloody pen in his right. This posture looked very funny. Also, this guy beside me doesn't want to raise his hands and surrender. Shi Qinghai looked at the nervous and solemn special forces of the Federation in front of him and said seriously and sincerely, "Both of his hands are disabled. He really can't raise them." Su Lu, who had been keeping his head down, finally couldn't help but laugh out loud. The cigarette in his mouth spat out and fell to the ground, splashing a few sparks. You're tuning in to the Phoenix Nights YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.